In the vast emptiness between galaxies, where no star burns and no world turns, there exists only silence. An eternal darkness that has persisted since the universe drew its first breath. Here, in this void so complete that even the light of distant galaxy clusters appears as mere pinpricks against the cosmic night, something ancient stirs. The space between our galaxy and its neighbors spans millions of light-years, distances so immense that the human mind struggles to comprehend them. Yet even in this seemingly barren expanse, life finds a way. Not the familiar life of oxygen-breathing creatures or silicon-based constructs, but something far older, far hungrier, and infinitely more patient. For countless eons, while the galaxy that would one day house humanity was still forming its first stars, these entities drifted through the intergalactic medium. They moved with purpose, though that purpose remained hidden in the alien depths of a consciousness unlike anything the universe had yet produced. They were not mere creatures. They were evolution itself given form, hunger given substance. The year was 745.BEM41, when they finally crossed the threshold into our galaxy. The Great Devourer had arrived, though the Imperium would not learn this name for many years to come. What they would eventually call Hive Fleet Behemoth represented the vanguard of something far more terrible, the first tendril of an invasion that had been planned over geological timescales. Beyond the eastern fringe of the galaxy, where Imperial cartographers marked their maps with warnings of unknown dangers, reality itself seemed to shift and change. The first signs came not as explosions or invasive fleets, but as an absence, worlds that simply stopped transmitting their daily reports, systems that fell silent without explanation, and merchant vessels that vanished between routine warp jumps without even managing to send a distress signal. Hive Fleet Behemoth stretched across light-years of space, a living constellation of bioships that defied every convention of naval architecture known to the Imperium, where human vessels were built from steel and adamantium. Festooned with weapons batteries and void shields, these ships were alive. Each vessel was a creature unto itself, grown rather than constructed, evolved rather than designed over millions of years of constant refinement. The smallest of these bioships dwarfed Imperial escort vessels, while the largest possessed mass equivalent to entire battleships or even space stations. Their hulls pulsed with biological rhythms, great hearts the size of building pumping vital fluids through arterial corridors while massive lungs processed the sparse hydrogen and cosmic dust of interstellar space. Sensor organs that resembled enormous eyes swept the void ahead, detecting the electromagnetic signatures of inhabited worlds with predatory precision. These were not ships carrying an invasion force. They were the invasion force itself, and every cell within their living hulls existed for a single purpose: to locate, consume, and digest all biological matter they encountered. The Tyranids themselves represented biological perfection, achieved through constant evolution and adaptation. Over the millions of years of their journey from distant galaxies, they had consumed entire star systems, incorporating the genetic material of countless species into their ever-expanding biological database. Each world devoured had made them stronger, more adaptable, more perfectly suited to their role as the galaxy's apex predators. Every creature within the Hive fleet had been designed by evolution for a specific function. Warrior forms with blade arms that could slice through ceramide armor, flying creatures with acid-filled organs that could dissolve tank hulls, massive beetles that served as living siege engines, all connected by an invisible network of psychic communication that allowed them to coordinate their actions with perfect precision. Unlike the chaotic nature of orc invasions or the ritualistic warfare of Chaos Space Marines, the Tyranids brought with them a terrifying efficiency born of pure purpose. They did not fight for glory, territory, or ideology. They fought to consume, and everything, absolutely everything, was sustenance. Humans, Eldar, orcs, the very atmosphere of worlds, the organic compounds in the soil, the microscopic bacteria in the depths of the ocean, all would be broken down at the molecular level and absorbed into the growing biomass of the Hive fleet. At the heart of this vast organism was the Hive mind, a gestalt consciousness that connected every single Tyranid creature across the vastness of space. Individual Tyranids possessed no true independence of thought or will. They were extensions of this greater intelligence, as much a part of it as a human's hand is part of their body. The Hive mind could process information from billions of creatures simultaneously, learning from every encounter, adapting its strategies in real time and distributing new genetic improvements across the entire fleet within hours. This collective intelligence had experienced the rise and fall of entire civilizations during its journey between galaxies. It had consumed worlds inhabited by beings of pure energy, devoured hive cities filled with creatures that thought in mathematical concepts, and absorbed the genetic legacy of species that had achieved technological marvels beyond imperial comprehension. All of this knowledge, all of these evolutionary advantages, now moved inexorably toward the worlds of humanity. The first imperial worlds to encounter Hive fleet Behemoth were frontier colonies scattered along the Eastern Fringe, mining worlds extracting rare minerals from asteroid belts, agricultural planets feeding the forge worlds deeper in imperial space, and research stations monitoring the cosmic background radiation for signs of approaching threats. These worlds were lightly defended, their populations numbering in the millions rather than billions, making them perfect testing grounds for the Tyranids to refine their invasion techniques. The pattern was always the same. First came the Jane Stealers, scout organisms that had been seeded on merchant vessels and transport ships years earlier, hiding in the dark corners of cargo holds and spreading their genetic infection to unwitting hosts. These corrupted humans would establish cults that worshipped the coming of the Great Devourer, sabotaging planetary defenses and preparing the way for the main invasion. Then came the spores, billions upon billions of microscopic organisms released into a world's atmosphere, beginning the process of breaking down the planet's ecosystem even before the first Tyranid warriors set foot on the surface. The very air became toxic to native life forms while providing nutrients for the creatures that would soon follow. Finally came the swarm itself, descending from orbit in living drop pods that burst open like obscene flowers to disgorge their deadly cargo. The invasion that followed was not warfare in any conventional sense. It was harvest time, and every living thing on the planet was grain to be gathered. This was the force that now moved through the Eastern Fringe, growing stronger with each world consumed, learning from each victory, and adapting to overcome any resistance it encountered. The Imperium had faced many threats over the millennia: the rebellion of Horus, the constant incursions of chaos, the endless orc invasions. But nothing had prepared them for an enemy that sought not conquest or corruption, but the complete biological absorption of all life in the galaxy. The Great Devourer had awakened from its eons-long slumber, and its hunger was infinite. The first reports that reached the administrative offices on distant Terra were fragmentary and confused. Frontier worlds going silent was not unusual. The galaxy was vast. Communication networks were unreliable, and any number of hazards could disrupt regular transmissions. Clerks dutifully filed the reports under awaiting investigation and moved on to more pressing concerns. But Captain General Valdez of the Imperial Navy's Eastern Fleet had served the Emperor for over 2 centuries, and he recognized patterns that others missed. Standing in the stratagem of his flagship, the Righteous Fury, he studied the hololithic display that showed the slow but steady advance of silence across the Eastern Fringe. Red markers indicated worlds that had ceased all communication, while amber ones showed systems reporting unusual distress signals before falling quiet themselves. "It moves too systematically to be random," he murmured to his aide, a young commander whose augmetic eye whirred softly as it processed the tactical data. "Pirates strike targets of opportunity. Orcs rampage without pattern. This suggests intelligence. Purpose." The commander nodded nervously. "Should we dispatch reconnaissance vessels, sir?" Valdez was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he contemplated the display. 3 scout ships had already been sent to investigate the silence. None had returned. "Prepare the 3rd battle group for immediate deployment. Whatever is out there, we need to know what we're facing." Far from the marble halls of Terra and the steel corridors of Imperial warships, Hive fleet Behemoth continued its methodical approach toward the more densely populated regions of Imperial space. The fleet had grown significantly since its arrival in the galaxy. Its bioships now numbered in the thousands rather than hundreds. Each consumed world had provided new genetic material, new adaptations, and most importantly, new biomass to fuel the creation of additional vessels. But the hive mind had also learned that these humans were not helpless prey. They fought back with weapons that could damage even heavily armored Tyranid creatures, and they possessed a cunning that required constant adaptation to overcome. This was valuable information. Prey that fought back made the swarm stronger, forcing it to evolve more efficient killing methods. The bioships themselves had begun to show signs of this evolution. New weapon symbiotes had been spawned, living creatures that bonded with the ship's hull and could project streams of corrosive acids across void distances. Sensor organs had been enhanced with genetic material harvested from the compound eyes of local insect species, providing better target acquisition in the electromagnetic spectrum these humans seemed to favor for their communications. On the mining world of Sebastus 7, Magos biologists Kane detected unusual patterns in the birth registries. Subtle genetic variations were appearing with increasing frequency: enlarged craniums, elongated limbs, heightened reflexes. His reports to the Departamento Biologicus went unanswered. The bureaucrats of Terra had more pressing concerns than minor genetic drift on a frontier mining world. On the agricultural planet of Verdant Fields, Governor Hastur noticed that the local PDF recruitment numbers had dropped significantly. Young men and women were simply disappearing, leaving behind only whispered rumors of the coming transformation and crude drawings of four-armed beings with elongated skulls. His requests for Arbite's reinforcement were lost in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Sector Command. The bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth moved through the void with the patience of geological time and the inevitability of entropy itself. They did not hurry. There was no need. Every day brought them closer to the rich, densely populated worlds of the Ultramar sector, and every day their numbers grew as new vessels budded from the organic factories within the larger ships. The hive mind had tasted the genetic heritage of humanity and found it acceptable. Not the most sophisticated species it had ever encountered, certainly, but possessed of useful adaptations and present in sufficient numbers to provide substantial biomass for the next phase of its expansion. Once this galaxy was fully consumed, the knowledge and genetic material gained here would fuel the creation of new hive fleets, each one more perfect than the last. But the hive mind was also learning that these humans possessed something unexpected. They called it courage, though the alien intelligence understood it only as an irrational tendency to continue fighting even when victory was impossible. This trait would need to be studied carefully. Perhaps it could be replicated in future bioforms, or perhaps it represented a flaw that could be exploited. The great bioships continued their inexorable advance, leaving behind them a trail of stripped worlds, planets that had once teemed with life, now reduced to barren rock, their atmospheres thin and lifeless, their oceans drained of all organic compounds. Even the bacteria in the soil had been consumed, leaving behind only sterile minerals that would never again support life. This was the storm that approached the heart of Imperial space, not a tempest of wind and rain, but something far more terrible. A living hurricane of consumption that would strip away everything that made a world alive, leaving behind only empty stone orbiting a star that now illuminated nothing but death. The world of Tyran had never been considered strategically important. A modest mining colony situated on the outer edge of Imperial space, it boasted a population of barely 12 million souls spread across 3 primary settlements and dozens of smaller mining outposts. The planet's primary export was a rare mineral used in the construction of Voxcaster arrays, valuable enough to maintain regular shipping routes, but hardly the sort of world that would attract the attention of major military forces. Colonel Marcus Vespian of the Tyran 4th Regiment had served on the world for nearly a decade, and his greatest concerns had always been equipment maintenance and the occasional labor dispute among the mining guilds. The Planetary Defense Force consisted of 3 regiments of PDF troops equipped with standard-issue lasguns and a handful of aging Chimera transports. The orbital defenses amounted to a small monitoring station and a pair of defense platforms that hadn't fired their weapons in anger for over 50 years. It was Vespian who first spotted the anomaly on the long-range Auspex readings. Standing in the command center of Fort Salvation, the primary military installation overlooking Tyran's capital city of New Byzantium, he watched as his chief technical officer, Sergeant Major Helena Cross, adjusted the sensor array with practiced efficiency. "Sir, you need to see this," Cross said, her voice carrying a note of confusion that immediately caught Vespian's attention. "We're detecting massive objects on the edge of the system, but they're not matching any known ship classifications." Vespian moved to the display console, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the readings. The objects were enormous, far larger than any Imperial vessel he'd ever seen, and they were moving with a strange organic rhythm that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. How many are we looking at, Sergeant Major? Initial count suggests several hundred contacts, sir. But the readings are inconsistent. Some appear to be spawning smaller objects, while others seem to be merging together. I've never seen anything like it. The Colonel activated the long-range Vox array and began transmitting requests for identification to the approaching fleet. The responses that came back were not the formal Imperial codes he expected, but something else entirely. A low, almost subsonic humming that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone who heard it. Several of his Vox operators reported feeling nauseated after prolonged exposure to the signal. "Sir," Cross said, her voice now tight with worry, "I'm reading massive energy signatures from the fleet. They appear to be launching something." High above Tyran's atmosphere, the bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth began the process that had been perfected over countless worlds and millions of years. Massive sphincter-like openings dilated along the hulls of the larger vessels, revealing pulsing organic chambers filled with what appeared to be enormous seed pods. These pods, each one the size of a rhino transport, began launching toward the planet below in waves that numbered in the tens of thousands. The first spore bombardment began at dawn on the third day after the fleet's arrival. The pods entered Tyran's atmosphere like falling stars, their organic heat shields glowing cherry red as they plummeted toward the surface. Unlike conventional bombardment, these projectiles were not designed to explode on impact. They were designed to take root. Colonel Vespian watched from the observation deck of Fort Salvation as the first wave of pods struck the mining settlement of Hestia Prime, 200 kilometers to the north. Instead of explosions, he saw great clouds of yellowish spores billowing up from each impact site, spreading across the landscape like a living fog. Within hours, the very vegetation began to change. Trees withered and died, their biomass absorbed by strange fungal growths that sprouted with unnatural speed. But the spores carried more than just biological agents. They carried genetic templates, microscopic organisms designed to break down the planet's ecosystem and prepare it for what was to come. The air itself became toxic to human lungs, while simultaneously becoming breathable for creatures that had yet to make planetfall. Patrol Sergeant Davies was leading a routine reconnaissance mission through the Korhal Woods when his squad encountered the first of these creatures. Contact. Unknown hostiles emerging from the tree line. They're moving fast. Emperor's Throne. They're fast. Jenkins is down. Something tore right through his flak armor like it was paper. Requesting immediate backup. We're falling back to. The transmission ended in static and screaming. Colonel Vespian immediately mobilized 2 companies of the Tyran 4th to investigate the loss of Davies' patrol. What they found in the Korhal Woods would haunt the survivors for the rest of their very short lives. The patrol members had been completely consumed, not just killed but devoured so thoroughly that only scattered pieces of equipment remained to mark their passing. Strange organic structures had begun growing throughout the forest, pulsing with their own internal light and connected by web-like networks of biological material. Captain Elena Vasquez, leading the relief force, ordered her troops to establish a defensive perimeter around one of the smaller organic structures. Her field engineer, Sergeant Torres, approached the growth with an Auspex scanner and immediately backed away in horror. Before Vasquez could respond, the forest around them began to move. What they had taken for fallen logs and strange rock formations were revealed to be creatures, dozens of them, perfectly camouflaged and lying in wait. The ambush was perfectly coordinated, striking from all directions simultaneously with a precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal cunning. The battle that followed lasted only minutes, but it established patterns that would be repeated across thousands of worlds in the years to come. The Tyranid creatures fought with perfect coordination, each one seeming to know exactly what its fellows were doing without any visible communication. They adapted their tactics in real time, learning from each Imperial counterattack and adjusting their approach accordingly. Most terrifying of all was their apparent lack of self-preservation instinct. Individual creatures would sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it meant achieving a tactical advantage, throwing themselves onto Imperial weapons to allow their brethren to close to melee range, or using their own bodies as living bridges to cross defensive barriers. Captain Vasquez managed to escape the forest ambush with only 12 of her original 100-man company. Her report to Colonel Vespian was the first tactical analysis of Tyranid combat doctrine ever recorded. They don't fight like anything we've ever encountered. No individual initiative but perfect group coordination. They learn from every engagement, adapting faster than we can counter their adaptations. Sir, I don't think our current tactics are going to be sufficient. The colonel began preparing Tyran's defenses for a full-scale invasion, but he was operating under assumptions that would prove fatally flawed. He positioned his forces to defend key infrastructure points, established overlapping fields of fire around the major population centers, and requested reinforcements from the sector command. All standard Imperial doctrine for repelling an invasion. But the Tyranids were not invading in any conventional sense. They were harvesting, and their approach was dictated by biological imperatives rather than military ones. The spore bombardment intensified, with new types of pods bringing different organisms to the planet's surface. Some contained warrior forms the size of space marines, their blade arms capable of slicing through ceramite armor. Others carried flying creatures that could strike from above with deadly precision. Most disturbing were the pods that contained no visible creatures at all, but instead released clouds of microscopic organisms that began converting the planet's atmosphere at the molecular level. Humans exposed to these clouds found their lungs burning, their skin blistering, and their bodies breaking down as alien bacteria consumed them from the inside out. The siege of New Byzantium began on the 10th day after the first spore fall. The Tyranids approached the city not as an army, but as a living tide of flesh and chitin that flowed around and over the defensive positions with fluid grace. Colonel Vespian's carefully planned kill zones and overlapping fields of fire proved ineffective against an enemy that could simply absorb casualties and continue advancing. The battle for Tyran's capital lasted 3 days and 2 nights of continuous fighting. The PDF regiments fought with desperate courage, but they were facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. When the defenders used their few pieces of heavy artillery to devastating effect against massed warrior forms, the next wave included creatures with hardened carapaces that could deflect even last cannon fire. Colonel Vespian made his final stand in the command bunker beneath Fort Salvation, surrounded by the survivors of 3 regiments that had been reduced to barely 200 effective combatants. His last transmission to Sector Command was brief and to the point. Tyran is lost. Unknown xenospecies has consumed the planet. They are unlike anything in our tactical databases. Send everything you have, and Emperor preserve us. Send it now. The transmission ended as Tyranid warrior forms breached the bunker's blast doors. In the weeks that followed, Hive Fleet Behemoth completed the consumption of Tyran with methodical efficiency. Every living organism on the planet was broken down and absorbed, from the largest predators to the smallest microbes. The oceans were drained of all organic compounds, the atmosphere was processed and consumed, and even the bacterial colonies living in the planet's crust were harvested and integrated into the growing biomass of the Hive fleet. When the process was complete, Tyran remained as a barren rock orbiting its star, a dead world stripped of everything that had once made it alive. But the biomass harvested from its consumption had been used to spawn dozens of new bioships, and the genetic information gathered from its native species had been integrated into the Tyranid racial memory. The hive mind had learned much from the conquest of Tyran. It had analyzed human tactics, studied their weapons, and dissected their biological weaknesses. Most importantly, it had confirmed that this galaxy contained vast quantities of biomass suitable for consumption, and that the resistance encountered, while determined, was not insurmountable. The first great harvest was complete, but it was merely the beginning. The storm that had consumed Tyran now turned its attention toward richer targets, toward worlds that contained billions rather than millions of potential prey. The hive mind had tasted human flesh and found it adequate fuel for the next phase of its expansion. The name Tyranids would spread throughout the Imperium as reports of the world's fate reached Terra, but by then, Hive Fleet Behemoth was already approaching the next system on its path of consumption. The Great Devourer had awakened, and its hunger would not be satisfied until every living thing in the galaxy had been consumed and integrated into its ever-growing mass. In the fortress monastery of Macragge, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar stood before the great tactical display that dominated the center of the strategium. The hololithic projection showed the current state of the Eastern Fringe, with red indicators marking the worlds that had fallen silent over the past months. What had begun as isolated incidents had coalesced into a clear pattern of advance. Something was moving through Imperial space with methodical precision, consuming everything in its path. Calgar was a giant among giants, even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes. His power armor bore the scars of centuries of warfare, and his face carried the weathered dignity of a warrior who had led his men through countless battles against the enemies of mankind. But as he studied the tactical display, his expression carried a gravity that his battle brothers had rarely seen. "Show me the timeline again, Cassius," he said to the veteran chaplain who stood at his side. Chaplain Cassius, his skull-faced helm maglocked to his belt, manipulated the display controls with practiced efficiency. The hologram shifted to show the progression of world deaths over time, each one marked with Imperial dating and the last known transmission from the doomed planet. The pattern began approximately 4 months ago, with the mining world of Prandium on the far edge of the Segmentum Ultima, Cassius reported, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a warrior scholar. "Since then, we have confirmed the loss of 27 worlds, with another 15 reporting unusual phenomena before communication was severed." Captain Ageman of the First Company stepped forward, his Terminator honors glinting in the chamber's harsh lighting. "The survivors from Tyran provided our most detailed intelligence. Whatever we're facing, it's unlike anything in our tactical databases. The creatures they describe don't match any known Xenos classification." "Lord Calgar," came a new voice from the chamber's entrance. Captain Sicarius of the Second Company strode into the strategium, his expression troubled. "Long-range Auspex contacts have been confirmed. We have massive objects approaching the Ultramar sector. Estimated time to Macragge's system is 6 months." The chapter master studied the newest additions to the tactical display. The objects were enormous, larger than any Imperial vessel, and they moved in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose. More troubling still was their number. Initial estimates suggested hundreds of contacts, with more appearing on the sensors each day. "Gentlemen," Calgar said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 centuries of command, "it appears that whatever consumed Tyran is coming here. Captain Sicarius, I want all companies recalled immediately. Send word to our successor chapters. We're going to need every battle brother we can muster." The mobilization of the Ultramarines began within hours of that conference. Across the Ultramar sector, strike cruisers and battle barges received urgent recall orders, abandoning ongoing campaigns and long-term deployments to return to the defense of their home worlds. The chapters recruiting worlds increased their training quotas, rushing neophytes through the final stages of their transformation into full battle brothers. But Calgar knew that Space Marines alone would not be sufficient to face this threat. The tactical data from Tyran suggested an enemy that could adapt to any conventional military response, one that grew stronger with each engagement. This would require a coordinated defense involving every Imperial asset in the sector. Admiral Cornelius of the Ultramar Defense Fleet found himself summoned to an unprecedented joint planning session in the Fortress of Hera. The elderly naval officer had served alongside the Ultramarines for over 40 years, but he had never seen them display the level of concern that now characterized their preparations. "Admiral," Calgar began without preamble, "I need every ship you can spare positioned at strategic points throughout the system. These creatures, whatever they are, seem to be entirely biological in nature. Standard void warfare tactics may not apply." Admiral Cornelius studied the intelligence reports with the practiced eye of a veteran naval officer. "The size of these bioships is unprecedented, Lord Calgar. Our largest battle cruisers would be dwarfed by the smallest vessels in their fleet. We're going to need to develop entirely new tactical doctrines for void engagement." Captain Ageman gestured to a series of reports laid out on the conference table. The survivors from Tyran described creatures that could adapt to our weapons in real time. If they apply the same principles to void warfare, we may find our traditional advantages negated very quickly. The planning sessions continued for weeks as the Ultramarines prepared for a type of warfare they had never encountered. Standard Imperial doctrine called for concentration of force and the application of overwhelming firepower, but the intelligence from Tyran suggested that such tactics might actually strengthen the enemy by providing them with opportunities to study and counter Imperial capabilities. Chief Librarian Tigurius emerged from deep meditation with disturbing news. The Psyker's normally serene expression was troubled as he reported his findings to the chapter master. "My lord, the warp itself grows quiet in the direction of their approach. It's as if something is consuming the psychic emanations of entire star systems. I've never encountered anything like it." This revelation added another layer of complexity to the defensive preparations. If the creatures could somehow drain or nullify psychic energy, then many of the Imperium's most potent weapons would be useless. The Ultramarines began training for purely conventional warfare, setting aside their reliance on psychic reconnaissance and astropathic communication. The civilian populations of the Ultramar worlds received evacuation orders couched in terms of strategic repositioning and temporary relocation for system defense exercises. The truth was far grimmer. Calgar had no illusions about the fate that awaited any world that fell to these creatures. The complete consumption of Tyran had made it clear that there could be no coexistence with this enemy. Governor Ajax of Kalth protested the evacuation orders in a heated Vox conference with the chapter master. Lord Calgar, you're asking me to abandon 3 billion citizens and the industrial infrastructure of an entire Hive world based on reports from a handful of traumatized refugees. The economic implications alone. Governor, Calgar interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I have seen the tactical footage from Tyran. I have interviewed the survivors personally. Whatever is approaching us views human beings as nothing more than raw materials for its own growth. Your economic concerns will be irrelevant if your population is consumed down to the cellular level. The evacuation proceeded, though not without significant resistance from planetary governments and merchant guilds, who stood to lose enormous investments. Millions of civilians were transported to fortified positions deeper within the Ultramar sector, while the valuable industrial equipment was either relocated or rigged for demolition to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Captain Cronus of the Ultramarines vehicle pool worked around the clock to prepare the chapter's armored assets for the coming conflict. The reports from Tyran suggested that the creatures were vulnerable to concentrated firepower, but they also indicated that the enemy could spawn new forms specifically designed to counter effective Imperial weapons systems. We're going to need redundancy in everything, Cronus explained to his technical staff. If they adapt to counter our Predator tanks, we need Land Raiders standing by. If they develop resistance to bolter fire, we need Flamers and Meltaguns ready to deploy. We cannot allow ourselves to become dependent on any single weapons system. The fortress monastery itself underwent extensive modifications as the Ultramarines prepared for the possibility of a siege. Additional weapon emplacements were constructed, ammunition stockpiles were expanded, and the ancient void shields were tested and reinforced. If the creatures made planetfall on Macragge, they would find the Ultramarines ready for a fight that could last for months. But perhaps the most significant preparation was psychological. The Ultramarines had always prided themselves on their adherence to the Codex Astartes and their ability to adapt Guilliman's tactical doctrines to any battlefield. Now they faced an enemy that challenged the very foundations of their military philosophy. Creatures that could out-adapt their adaptations, that grew stronger through conflict rather than weaker. Chaplain Cassius addressed the chapter's battle brothers in the great chapel of the monastery, his words carrying across the vaulted chamber to warriors who had never known defeat. Brothers, we face an enemy unlike any we have encountered in our long history. They do not fight for glory, for territory, or for ideology. They fight to consume, and they view every living thing in this galaxy as prey. The chapel was silent as the assembled Space Marines absorbed this revelation. Many of them had fought Chaos Space Marines who sought to corrupt and enslave. Others had battled orcs who reveled in violence for its own sake. But none had faced an enemy whose very existence represented a threat to all life in the galaxy. But we are the Emperor's chosen, Cassius continued, his voice rising with conviction. We are the sons of Guilliman, inheritors of his wisdom and his strength. Whatever these creatures are, whatever advantages they may possess, they have never faced the Ultramarines in battle. They will learn that there are some prey too dangerous to hunt. The months of preparation culminated in a massive war council held in the Stratesium as long-range sensors confirmed the approach of the alien fleet. Representatives from across the Ultramar sector attended. Space Marine captains, Imperial Guard generals, Navy admirals, and planetary governors. The hololithic display now showed the enemy fleet in terrifying detail, with individual bioships clearly visible as they moved through the outer system. Gentlemen, Calgar began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. The enemy has arrived. Intelligence estimates suggest we are facing a fleet numbering in the thousands, with individual vessels massing equivalent to our largest battleships. They have consumed 43 confirmed worlds in their approach to our sector, and there is no reason to believe they intend anything different for us. Admiral Cornelius stood to address the assembly, his uniform bearing the decorations of decades of faithful service. The fleet is positioned according to Plan Tertius, with heavy units concentrated around Macragge and rapid response squadrons deployed to protect the evacuation routes. However, I must emphasize that we are operating without any reliable intelligence about enemy void warfare capabilities. The War Council continued through the night as final preparations were made and contingency plans were reviewed. By dawn, the Ultramar sector had been transformed into a fortress, with every available resource dedicated to the defense of humanity against an enemy that sought not conquest but complete biological absorption. As the assembled leaders departed to take their positions, Calgar remained in the strategium with his most trusted advisors. The tactical display showed the enemy fleet growing larger by the hour, as more bioships emerged from the darkness between stars. In 6 months, perhaps less, they would reach Macragge. "My lord," Captain Sicarius said quietly, "what if our preparations are not sufficient? What if these creatures prove to be beyond our ability to defeat?" Calgar turned from the display to face his captain, and in his eyes was the unshakable determination that had made him one of the greatest chapter masters in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. "Then we will make them pay such a price for this system that they will remember the name Ultramarines for the rest of their existence. And if we fall, we will ensure that our deaths provide the knowledge needed for the rest of humanity to survive." The storm was coming, and the Ultramarines were ready to meet it. The first contact between the Ultramar Defense Fleet and Hive Fleet Behemoth occurred at the edge of the Macragge system, beyond the orbit of the outermost gas giant. Admiral Cornelius watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Emperor's Will, as his long-range Auspex operators struggled to make sense of the readings they were receiving. "Sir, the enemy fleet is dispersing," reported Commander Vex, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Individual vessels are breaking formation and spreading throughout the outer system. It's not matching any known tactical doctrine." The Admiral studied the tactical display with growing unease. Imperial naval doctrine called for concentrated fleet formations that could bring maximum firepower to bear on enemy vessels. But the bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth were scattering across millions of kilometers of space, making it impossible to engage them as a unified force. "It's not a tactical formation," Admiral Cornelius realized with growing horror. "They're not positioning for battle. They're positioning for harvest. They intend to consume everything in the system simultaneously." Captain Mordian's squadron managed to destroy 3 smaller bioships before being overwhelmed by a swarm of creatures that seemed to pour endlessly from the larger vessels. His final transmission was brief and to the point. "They learn too fast. Every tactic we use they counter within minutes. Request immediate reinforcement." The transmission ended as the bioships swarmed over the righteous fury, their boarding pods penetrating the hull like parasites burrowing into flesh. The crew fought valiantly, but they were facing creatures specifically adapted for void warfare. Tyranids with hardened carapaces that could survive in vacuum, with limbs designed for movement in zero gravity, and with senses that could track prey through the metal corridors of Imperial warships. Admiral Cornelius watched the destruction of Squadron Tertius with growing dread. In less than 2 hours, 3 cruisers and 5 escort vessels had been consumed, their crews devoured and their hulls stripped of anything useful before being cast aside as empty metal shells. "All squadrons, withdraw to defensive positions around Macragge," he ordered. "Engage only when you have overwhelming local superiority, and be prepared to disengage immediately if the enemy begins adapting to your tactics." But the Hive fleet was not interested in pursuing a conventional void battle. While Admiral Cornelius attempted to coordinate his remaining forces, the bioships began the process that had been perfected across countless systems: the seeding of worlds for consumption. Macragge's early warning stations detected the first wave of spore pods as they entered the upper atmosphere. Unlike the random bombardment that had devastated Tyran, this assault was precisely targeted. Spores fell on the major population centers, the industrial complexes, and most ominously, on the carefully prepared defensive positions that the Ultramarines had spent months fortifying. Captain Sicarius commanded the second company from a command bunker overlooking the sprawling expanse of Hera City, Macragge's largest urban center, through the reinforced viewports. He watched as the spore clouds began their work of transformation. The very air shimmered with alien microorganisms, and the local vegetation began changing within hours of exposure. "Brother Sergeant Dacius," Sicarius voxed to his senior non-commissioned officer. "What are your scouts reporting from the outer perimeter?" The response came through with disturbing clarity. "The spores are not just biological agents, Captain. They're carrying some form of intelligence. The growth patterns are too organized, too purposeful. It's as if they're preparing the battlefield according to some predetermined plan." This was confirmed when the first Tyranid organisms began emerging from the pods that had fallen in the industrial sector. These were not the random creatures that might be expected from a purely biological invasion, but specialized forms that seemed designed for specific tactical roles. Burrowing creatures began tunneling beneath the defensive lines, while flying forms conducted reconnaissance of Imperial positions with intelligence that suggested detailed planning. Most disturbing were the creatures that seemed to be studying Imperial equipment and fortifications without immediately attacking. Scout Sergeant Tyran reported observing groups of Tyranids that would approach abandoned vehicles or weapon emplacements, examine them carefully with specialized sensory organs, and then withdraw to areas where new creatures were being spawned. "They're learning our capabilities before committing to assault," T-Line reported during a brief lull in the reconnaissance activities. "Every piece of equipment they examine results in new adaptations appearing in the next wave of creatures." Chapter Master Calgar received these reports in the command center of the Fortress of Hera, the Ultramarines' primary stronghold on Macragge. The tactical displays showed Tyranid organisms spreading across the planet's surface like a living infection. But their behavior patterns were unlike anything in Imperial tactical databases. "They're not trying to secure territory," observed Captain Ageman as he studied the enemy movements. "They're conducting a systematic biological survey of the entire planet. Every ecosystem, every population center, every defensive installation. They're cataloging everything before beginning the actual assault." Chief Librarian Tigurius emerged from his meditation chamber with news that added another layer of complexity to the situation. "My lord, the psychic emanations from the enemy fleet are wrong. They're not using the warp in any way we understand. Instead, they seem to be creating some form of shadow in the Imperium, a void that dampens our psychic abilities while enhancing their own coordination." This phenomenon, which would later be understood as the shadow in the warp, had immediate tactical implications. Astropathic communication became unreliable, making it difficult to coordinate defensive efforts across the planet. More troubling still, the Space Marine librarians found their psychic powers significantly reduced, robbing the Ultramarines of one of their key advantages in battle. But as the battle progressed, it became clear that these initial waves were not intended to capture the positions. They were probing attacks designed to test Imperial defensive capabilities. Each wave carried different creature types, and each was allowed to approach from different vectors to test the effectiveness of Imperial countermeasures. "They're using their own creatures as expendable test subjects," Sicarius realized with growing horror. "Every casualty they take is providing information for the next wave." Brother Sergeant Dacius fell to one of these infiltrators during what should have been a routine ammunition resupply. The creature had perfectly mimicked the appearance and behavior of a chapter serf, approaching the defensive position with apparent casualty reports. "Every engagement is making them stronger," Captain Sicarius reported to Chapter Master Calgar during a brief tactical conference. "They're not just adapting to our weapons. They're adapting to our psychology, our tactical doctrines, even our operational procedures. We need to fundamentally change our approach, or they'll eventually develop counters to everything we can field against them." The siege of Hera City lasted for 6 days, with the Tyranids gradually tightening their grip around the urban center, while spawning increasingly sophisticated organisms to counter each new Imperial defensive measure. By the 4th day, they had developed creatures that could neutralize the Ultramarines' heavy weapons, flying forms that could target Space Marine officers with sniper-like precision, and massive siege beasts that could breach even the strongest fortifications. The withdrawal was conducted with typical Ultramarines precision, but it came at a terrible cost. Of the 100 Space Marines who had begun the defense of Hera City, only 62 reached the fortress alive. The casualties included veteran sergeants with centuries of experience in battle, brothers, whose gene seed represented irreplaceable genetic heritage. But the true horror of the Tyranid assault became apparent when reconnaissance revealed what had happened to the areas they had overrun. Hera City, which had housed nearly 10 million civilians, was being systematically consumed. The Tyranids had not simply killed the population, They had absorbed them, breaking down every organic compound at the molecular level and incorporating the biomass into new creatures. Massive organic processing pools had been established throughout the captured areas, fed by streams of biological matter that flowed through newly grown capillary networks. The very buildings were being dissolved and consumed, their metal and stone components separated out, while any organic materials, wood, textiles, even the bacterial films on surfaces, were harvested for the growing Tyranid war machine. "They're not conquering our world," Chief Librarian Tigurius observed during a reconnaissance briefing. "They're digesting it. Every hour they control an area, that area becomes more useful to them and less recoverable by us." The Fortress of Hera itself came under direct assault on the 10th day of the siege. The Tyranids had spent the previous days studying the fortress's defenses, probing for weaknesses, and spawning creatures specifically designed to overcome the Ultramarines' strongest position. The attack, when it came, was preceded by a bombardment unlike anything the Space Marines had ever experienced. Instead of conventional artillery, the Tyranids used living weapons, creatures that launched themselves at the fortress walls with explosive force, bioplasma organisms that sprayed acid capable of dissolving ceramite, and most terrifying of all, spore mines that sought out defensive positions with predatory intelligence. The outer walls of the fortress, which had withstood 10,000 years of warfare, began to buckle under the assault. Captain Aegimon's first company Terminators made their stand in the breach, their storm bolters and power fists taking a terrible toll on the attacking creatures. But for every Tyranid they killed, 2 more seemed to take its place, each one slightly better adapted to counter Terminator armor than the last. Brother Sergeant Cronus led a desperate counterattack with the chapter's remaining armored vehicles, his Land Raiders and Predator tanks smashing through the Tyranid lines to buy time for the fortress defenses to be reorganized. But even the mighty Land Raiders, armored vehicles that had never known defeat, began to succumb to creatures that had been specifically evolved to counter Imperial armor. The Tyranids deployed organisms that could burrow beneath the vehicles, attacking their tracks and drive systems. Flying creatures dropped acid pods that ate through even the thickest armor plating. Most disturbing were the boarding organisms, creatures that could tear through Land Raider hulls like paper and slaughter the crews within. By the end of the first day of the fortress assault, the Ultramarines had lost half their remaining vehicles and nearly a third of their battle brothers. Chapter Master Calgar himself took to the walls, his ancient suit of Terminator armor and master-crafted weapons cutting through Tyranid creatures with deadly efficiency. But even he could see that conventional tactics were proving insufficient against an enemy that grew stronger with each engagement. The breakthrough came when Chief Librarian Tigurius made a disturbing discovery about the nature of Tyranid coordination. Through careful psychic observation, he determined that the creatures were controlled by larger organisms that served as nodes in a biological command network. These synapse creatures were the key to the Tyranids' perfect coordination, and potentially their greatest weakness. This revelation led to a fundamental shift in Ultramarines' tactics. Instead of trying to kill every Tyranid creature, they began focusing their efforts on identifying and eliminating the synapse beasts that controlled the swarm. It was dangerous work. The synapse creatures were heavily protected and possessed formidable combat abilities of their own, but it offered the first real hope of victory. Captain Sicarius led the first synapse hunting mission, taking a strike force of his most experienced veterans deep into Tyranid-controlled territory. The mission succeeded, but at a terrible cost of the 20 Space Marines who had volunteered for the assault. Only Sicarius and 3 others returned alive. However, the death of the targeted synapse creature had caused nearly 1,000 lesser Tyranids to lose coordination, allowing the fortress defenders to eliminate them with comparative ease. The siege continued for another week, as the Ultramarines refined their new tactics, and the Tyranids adapted to counter them. But for the first time since the invasion began, the defenders were learning faster than their enemies. The knowledge gained from each successful synapse kill was immediately distributed throughout the chapter, while the Tyranids' own adaptation process was slowed by the loss of their coordination networks. The final assault on the Fortress of Hera came on the 20th day of the siege, as the Tyranids committed every remaining creature on the planet to a desperate attempt to break the Ultramarines' resistance. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most vicious in the chapter's history, with hand-to-hand combat raging in every corridor and chamber of the ancient fortress. Chapter Master Calgar made his stand in the central courtyard, where a massive Tyranid creature that would later be classified as a Swarmlord had breached the inner defenses. The duel between the chapter master and this apex predator lasted for nearly an hour, with both combatants suffering grievous wounds before Calgar finally struck the killing blow. But victory came at a price that would haunt the Ultramarines for centuries to come. Of the 1,000 Space Marines who had begun the defense of Macragge, fewer than 300 remained combat effective. The chapter's homeworld lay in ruins, its population consumed, its cities reduced to organic processing pools that would take decades to cleanse. Yet they had achieved something that no other Imperial force had managed. They had stopped a Tyranid Hive fleet in its tracks, proving that these creatures, for all their adaptability and hunger, could be defeated by courage, determination, and tactical brilliance. The siege of Macragge was over, but the First Tyrannic War had only just begun. Among the many heroes who emerged during the dark days of the siege of Macragge, none exemplified the spirit of sacrifice more than Captain Saul Invictus of the Ultramarines' First Company. A veteran of 3 centuries of warfare, Invictus had earned his reputation through countless battles against the enemies of mankind, but it would be his final act of service that secured his place in the chapter's most sacred records. The power distribution center of the Fortress of Hera had become a critical point of contention as the siege entered its most desperate phase. The facility, buried deep beneath the fortress's foundations, provided energy to the void shields and defensive batteries that were all that stood between the remaining Ultramarines and complete annihilation. Tyranid tunnel-form creatures had succeeded in breaching the facility's outer defenses, and their bioacid secretions were slowly eating through the reactor's containment systems. Captain Invictus volunteered to lead a desperate mission to restore the facility's integrity, knowing full well that the radiation levels in the compromised sections would prove fatal even to a Space Marine's enhanced physiology. Taking with him a small team of volunteers from the chapter's most experienced veterans, he descended into the depths of the fortress while Tyranid creatures swarmed through the corridors above. Brother Sergeant Ultramarines, the sole survivor of Invictus's final mission, later provided the only first-hand account of what transpired in those irradiated depths. The team had fought their way through swarms of smaller Tyranid creatures to reach the reactor chamber, where they discovered that the damage was far worse than initial reports had suggested. The captain assessed the situation immediately. Ultramarines recalled during his debriefing with Chaplain Cassius, the containment field generators had been almost completely dissolved by Tyranid bioacids. Manual restoration would require someone to remain in the chamber for at least 40 minutes, while the systems cycled through their startup sequence. The radiation exposure would be lethal within 30. The Tyranid tunnel forms launched one final assault on the facility as Invictus worked, their numbers seemingly endless as they poured through the breached sections. The remaining members of his team fought a desperate holding action in the access corridors, buying their captain the time he needed to complete his work. Brother Sergeant Ultramarines himself suffered grievous wounds during this final battle, his left arm severed by a Tyranid warrior form's scythe-like appendage. We could hear the captain's voice over the vox throughout the battle, Ultramarines reported. He was reciting the canticles of sacrifice, his voice never wavering even as the radiation began to affect his vocal cords. When the containment fields finally stabilized, he transmitted a single message: the fortress endures, the chapter endures, the Emperor protects. Captain Saul Invictus died at his post, his body too irradiated for recovery even by the chapter's most advanced medical technology. But his sacrifice had saved not only the power facility, but potentially the entire remaining population of the fortress. The void shields that his actions had preserved would prove crucial in repelling the final Tyranid assault 2 days later. In accordance with ancient chapter traditions, Invictus's gene seed was preserved and his consciousness was later interred within the shell of a dreadnought, allowing him to continue serving the Emperor even in death. Brother Dreadnought Invictus would go on to fight in dozens of subsequent campaigns, his plasma cannon and power fist bringing death to the enemies of mankind for centuries to come. Brother Apothecary Cordius performed medical miracles under impossible conditions, treating wounded Space Marines in makeshift aid stations while Tyranid creatures literally chewed through the walls around him. Working with equipment cobbled together from battlefield salvage, he managed to save the lives of dozens of battle brothers who would have otherwise perished from their wounds. His work became even more critical when it was discovered that Tyranid bioweapons carried exotic toxins that interfered with normal Space Marine healing processes. master of the Forge Fenian Gaiax, worked around the clock to keep the chapter's vehicles and weapons operational under siege conditions. With supply lines cut and manufacturing facilities overrun, he was forced to cannibalize damaged equipment to keep essential systems running. His jury-rigged modifications to standard bolter ammunition proved particularly effective against Tyranid carapaces, providing the chapter's battle brothers with desperately needed firepower advantages. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the stories of the civilians caught in the Tyranid advance. On the agricultural world of Kolth, Governor Magnus Creedy made the agonizing decision to evacuate only the children and elderly, leaving behind millions of able-bodied adults to continue food production for as long as possible. His final transmission to the evacuation fleet was simple: "Tell them we died as servants of the Emperor, and that the children must remember what we were." The mining world of Talisker became the site of one of the most desperate last stands in the sector's history. Unable to evacuate their population before the Tyranids arrived, the planetary governor ordered all civilians into the deepest mining shafts, hoping that the planet's complex geology might provide some protection. For 3 weeks, nearly 50,000 people survived in the depths while Tyranid creatures consumed the surface above them. The rescue came when a strike force of Ultramarines managed to break through the Tyranid blockade, but by then starvation and despair had claimed many lives. The survivors spoke of hearing strange sounds echoing through the mine shafts, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the planet's core itself. Later investigation revealed that the Tyranids had been using massive digester organisms to process the planet's crust, literally consuming the world from within. Captain Helena Voss of the light cruiser Stalwart Defiance became famous throughout the fleet for her innovative tactics against the bioships. Recognizing that conventional weapons had limited effectiveness against self-repairing targets, she began using her ship's cargo holds to deliver massive explosive charges directly into the bioship's digestive chambers. The tactic required her vessel to come dangerously close to the enemy ships, but the internal explosions proved far more effective than external bombardment. "We're not trying to sink ships," Captain Voss explained during a fleet commander's conference. "We're trying to kill organisms. Hit them where they eat, where they breed, where they think. That's how you stop something that can regrow a hull breach in minutes." The psychological toll of the siege was perhaps as significant as the physical casualties. Space Marines, who had never known defeat, found themselves retreating from positions they had held for centuries. Veterans who had faced the horrors of chaos and the fury of orc invasions spoke of nightmares filled with endless swarms of chittering creatures that adapted to every weapon, every tactic, every desperate stratagem. "We face an enemy that knows no fear, no doubt, no mercy," Cassius proclaimed during one particularly dark moment of the siege. "But we possess something they cannot comprehend, the knowledge that some things are worth dying for. Our sacrifice has meaning because it serves something greater than ourselves. Their hunger is infinite, but our faith is eternal." The chapter's librarians faced their own unique challenges, as the shadow and the warp continued to interfere with their psychic abilities. Chief Librarian Tigurius discovered that prolonged exposure to the psychic null field generated by the Tyranid Hive fleet was causing permanent damage to the psychic centers of the brain. Several junior librarians lost their abilities entirely, while others began experiencing devastating feedback whenever they attempted to use their powers. Yet even under these conditions, the librarians continued to serve, using their reduced abilities to coordinate defensive efforts and gather intelligence about enemy movements. Epistolary Callisterius sacrificed his life during a psychic reconnaissance mission, pushing his damaged abilities beyond their limits to provide crucial information about Tyranid tunnel networks beneath the fortress. The siege's most tragic casualties were perhaps the chapter's aspirants, young men who had been in various stages of transformation into Space Marines when the invasion began. Many were still recovering from surgical implantation of gene seed organs when they were forced to take up arms in defense of the fortress. These half-transformed warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing that their incomplete augmentations meant they were unlikely to survive the rigors of extended combat. Brother Aspirant Thuron, barely 16 years old, and still adapting to his recently implanted secondary heart, held a breach in the fortress's outer wall for 4 hours against overwhelming odds. His standard-issue bolter jammed early in the engagement, forcing him to fight with nothing but his combat knife and the determination that had marked him as Space Marine material. When reinforcements finally reached his position, they found him still standing, though his body bore over 30 separate wounds that would have killed an ordinary human instantly. These stories of individual heroism were repeated thousands of times throughout the siege, creating a legacy of sacrifice that would inspire the Ultramarines for millennia to come. Each act of valor, each moment of selflessness, each life given in service to the Emperor became part of the chapter's living history, proof that even the most overwhelming enemy could be resisted through courage and determination. As the siege entered its final phase, these accumulated sacrifices began to tell. The Tyranids, for all their adaptability and numerical superiority, were facing an enemy that refused to break, refused to surrender, and continued fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The lesson would not be lost on the Hive mind, which began to reassess the cost-effectiveness of prolonged engagements with Space Marine forces. The heroes of Macragge had bought something precious with their blood: time for reinforcements to arrive, knowledge for future battles, and most importantly, proof that the Great Devourer could be stopped. The first sign that the tide of battle might be changing came not from the embattled fortress of Macragge, but from the void beyond the planet's atmosphere. Admiral Cornelius, commanding what remained of the Ultramar defense fleet from his battered flagship, received an urgent astropathic transmission that would transform the strategic situation across the entire sector. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled excitement, "we're receiving Imperial Navy identification codes from multiple fleet elements approaching the system. It appears to be Battle Group Solar under the command of Admiral Wrath." The Imperial Fist's Third Company, fresh from a successful campaign against Orc raiders in the Segmentum Solar, had answered the call for aid. Behind them came elements of the Howling Griffins, the Eagle Warriors, and most significantly, the Aurora chapter, direct successors of the Ultramarines whose gene seed carried the same proud heritage as their beleaguered brothers on Macragge. Chapter Master Calgar received the news while directing the defense of the fortress's eastern wall, where Tyranid tunnel forms had created a breach that required constant vigilance to prevent exploitation. Despite his exhaustion and the grievous wounds he had sustained during 3 weeks of continuous combat, his voice carried renewed strength as he addressed his remaining company commanders. "Brothers, the Emperor has heard our prayers. Relief comes not just in the form of ships and guns, but in the shape of our cousins, who share our gene seed and our determination. We have held the line long enough for help to arrive. Now we must hold it long enough for that help to be effective." But the arrival of reinforcements also brought sobering intelligence about the true scope of the Tyranid threat. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists reported that 3 other Hive fleet tendrils had been detected approaching different sectors of the galaxy, suggesting that Behemoth was merely one appendage of a far larger organism. The creatures that had seemed so overwhelming when confined to the Eastern Fringe were revealed to be part of an invasion force that spanned multiple star systems. "The enemy we face here is not unique," Captain Lysander explained during a hasty command conference in the fortress's damaged strategium. "Intelligence from across the galaxy suggests that similar fleets are approaching other sectors. We're not just fighting for Macragge, we're fighting to develop tactics that can be used against this threat wherever it appears." This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the battle. Victory on Macragge would no longer be measured simply by the survival of the fortress, or the preservation of the Ultramarines chapter. Every engagement, every tactical innovation, every lesson learned through blood and sacrifice would need to be documented and transmitted to Imperial forces across the galaxy. The first coordinated counterattack began with a massive void engagement, as Admiral Wrath's fresh fleet elements engaged the Tyranid bioships that had been bombarding Macragge from orbit. The Imperial vessels, benefiting from months of tactical intelligence gathered by Admiral Cornelius's battered squadrons, implemented new targeting priorities that focused on the bioships' digestive and reproductive organs rather than their weapons symbiotes. The results were dramatically different from the earlier void battles, where previous engagements had seen Imperial ships slowly ground down by self-repairing biovessels. The new tactics achieved decisive kills that prevented the Tyranids from regenerating damaged ships. Captain Voss's sacrifice aboard the stalwart Defiance had provided the key insight. These creatures could be killed if you struck at their vital organs rather than their extremities. "Target the feeding chambers," Admiral Wrath commanded from the bridge of his flagship, the Hammer of Terra. "Concentrate fire on the sections showing the highest energy readings. Those will be their digestive centers." And a bioship that can't process biomass is a bioship that will starve. Captain Sicarius led the first major ground offensive since the beginning of the siege, taking his rebuilt second company and elements of the Aurora chapter in a strike against the Tyranid processing pools that had been established in the ruins of Hera City. The mission had multiple objectives: to disrupt the enemy's biological production capabilities, to rescue any surviving civilians who might be held in the digestive chambers, and to gather detailed intelligence about Tyranid biotechnology. The assault on the processing pools revealed the true horror of what the Tyranids had done to Macragge's population. The facilities were not simply killing and consuming the captured civilians. They were keeping them alive while slowly harvesting their biological components, extracting useful genetic material while maintaining the victims in a state of conscious paralysis. Brother Apothecary Cordius, accompanying the strike force to document the biological processes for future study, emerged from the processing chambers with a report that would haunt everyone who read it. "They're not just eating our people," he reported to Captain Sicarius. "They're studying them, learning from them. Every person they capture provides not just biomass, but intelligence about human physiology, psychology, and genetic structure." The rescue operation managed to save nearly 3,000 civilians who had been held in various stages of processing. But the intelligence gathered from the facilities provided crucial insights into Tyranid biology and behavior. The creatures were not simply driven by mindless hunger. They were conducting systematic research, building a comprehensive database of information about every species they encountered. This knowledge led to a fundamental shift in Imperial tactics. Rather than simply trying to kill as many Tyranids as possible, the defending forces began focusing on disrupting the enemy's intelligence-gathering capabilities. Targeted strikes were launched against the synapse creatures that coordinated information flow, while specialized kill teams began hunting the observer organisms that had been studying Imperial equipment and tactics. The Aurora chapter, under the command of Captain Severus, proved particularly effective at these precision operations. Their expertise in stealth warfare and surgical strikes made them ideal for targeting the Tyranid command structure, and their intimate knowledge of Ultramarines' tactics allowed them to coordinate seamlessly with the defenders. "Every synapse creature we eliminate doesn't just disrupt their current operations," Captain Severus explained during a tactical briefing. "It also destroys part of their accumulated knowledge about our capabilities. We're not just degrading their command structure, we're making them forget what they've learned about fighting Space Marines." The psychological effect of these successful operations was significant. For the first time since the siege began, the Ultramarines and their allies were taking the initiative, striking at targets of their choosing rather than simply reacting to Tyranid attacks. The constant pressure that had ground down morale throughout the fortress began to ease as battle brothers saw evidence that their enemy could be hurt, confused, and ultimately defeated. Master of the Forge Fenian Gaiax made a crucial contribution to the changing tactical situation when his analysis of captured Tyranid bioweapons revealed a significant weakness in their adaptive capabilities. The creatures could modify their biology to counter specific threats, but these adaptations were not permanent. They required constant maintenance and could be disrupted by changing Imperial tactics faster than the Tyranids could respond. "They're like a biological computer that's constantly rewriting its own programming," Gaiax explained to the assembled commanders. "But if we can change our inputs faster than they can process the modifications, we can keep them in a constant state of adaptation lag. They'll always be configuring themselves to counter our previous tactics instead of our current ones." This insight led to the development of what became known as tactical cycling, a systematic approach to changing weapons, formations, and operational procedures on a schedule that prevented the Tyranids from fully adapting to any particular Imperial capability. Units would switch between different weapon types every few hours, alter their movement patterns regularly, and even change their Vox frequencies to prevent the enemy from developing effective countermeasures. The first large-scale test of these new tactics came during the Battle of the Eastern Approaches, where a combined force of Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, and Aurora Chapter Marines launched a coordinated assault on the largest remaining Tyranid concentration on Macragge. The operation involved over 500 Space Marines, supported by the remnants of the Planetary Defense Forces and elements of newly arrived Imperial Guard regiments. The battle lasted for 2 days and demonstrated the effectiveness of the new tactical doctrines. By constantly shifting their approaches and refusing to allow the Tyranids to establish predictable patterns of engagement, the Imperial forces maintained tactical superiority throughout the operation. Tyranid creatures that had been spawned to counter specific Imperial capabilities found themselves facing entirely different threats by the time they reached the battlefield. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists proved particularly effective at implementing these fluid tactics, using his company's expertise in siege warfare to create constantly changing defensive configurations that kept the Tyranids off balance. "We're not trying to build perfect defenses," he explained during the operation. "We're trying to build defenses that change faster than they can be analyzed and countered." The success of the Eastern Approaches operation marked a turning point in the siege. For the first time since the Tyranids had made planetfall, Imperial forces had achieved a decisive tactical victory that resulted in the complete elimination of a major enemy concentration. The lessons learned during this battle were immediately transmitted to Imperial forces throughout the galaxy, beginning the process of developing standardized anti-Tyranid tactics. But perhaps the most significant development was the capture of several intact synapse creatures during the operation. Chief Librarian Tigurius, working with Apothecary Cordius and elements from the Aurora Chapter's Librarium, began conducting detailed studies of these command organisms to understand how the Tyranid hive mind functioned. "The individual creatures are not truly intelligent," Tigurius reported after days of careful psychic examination. "They're extensions of a larger consciousness that exists within the hive fleet itself. If we can disrupt the psychic connections that bind them to this collective intelligence, we might be able to turn their own coordination against them." This research led to the development of psychic warfare techniques specifically designed to interfere with Tyranid command networks. While the Shadow and the Warp made such operations extremely dangerous for Imperial psychers, the potential advantages were enormous. A successful psychic attack could cause entire Tyranid formations to lose coordination, reverting to animal behavior that made them far easier to defeat. The first successful psychic disruption operation occurred during a Tyranid assault on the fortress's northern wall. Epistolary Numerius of the Aurora Chapter, working in coordination with two Ultramarines Lexicani, managed to sever the synaptic connections linking a formation of Tyranid warriors to their controlling organism. The results were immediate and dramatic. The previously coordinated assault dissolved into chaos as individual creatures began fighting each other instead of advancing on Imperial positions. "It worked better than we had hoped," Numerius reported afterward, though the strain of operating under the Shadow and the Warp had left him barely conscious. The creatures didn't just lose coordination, they lost their ability to distinguish between ally and enemy. They literally began consuming each other. Word of these tactical successes began to spread throughout the beleaguered fortress, carried by the wounded and the supply runners who moved between different defensive positions. Stories of Tyranid defeats, of successful operations, of enemy weaknesses discovered and exploited, began to counter the narrative of inevitable doom that had dominated the siege's early phases. Chaplain Cassius incorporated these victories into his battlefield sermons, using them as evidence that the Emperor's protection extended even to the darkest hours of humanity's struggle. "See how our enemies falter when faced with true faith," he proclaimed during a service held in the fortress's damaged chapel. "See how their alien cunning proves inferior to human courage guided by divine will." By the end of the 7th week of siege, the strategic situation had been fundamentally transformed. The Tyranids, while still present in significant numbers, had lost their ability to coordinate large-scale operations effectively. Their adaptive capabilities, which had seemed so overwhelming during the early battles, were being countered by Imperial tactical flexibility and growing understanding of alien biology. The tide had turned, but the final victory would require one last coordinated effort to eliminate the remaining Tyranid presence not just on Macragge, but throughout the entire star system. The knowledge and tactics developed during the siege would need to be tested on the largest possible scale, in a battle that would determine whether humanity had truly learned to defeat the Great Devourer. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would end the First Tyrannic War. The decision to launch the final assault against the remaining Tyranid forces came during a war council held in the depths of the Fortress of Hera, 7 weeks after the siege had begun. Chapter Master Calgar, his ancient Terminator armor bearing fresh scars from countless engagements, studied the tactical displays that showed the current disposition of forces across the Macragge system. The Tyranids had consolidated their remaining strength around the largest bioships in high orbit, creating a defensive formation that encompassed nearly a dozen massive vessels and hundreds of smaller craft. Intelligence reports suggested that these ships contained the core elements of the Hive fleet's command structure, the apex synapse creatures whose destruction might collapse the entire invasion force. The enemy has shown us their weakness. Calgar addressed the assembled commanders, his voice carrying the authority of 3 centuries of warfare. They require constant coordination to maintain their effectiveness. If we can sever the synaptic links that bind their fleet together, their individual vessels will become vulnerable to conventional attack. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists leaned forward over the tactical display, his scarred features thoughtful. The risk is considerable. If we fail to achieve synaptic disruption quickly enough, we'll be facing their full adaptive capabilities while committed to close-range engagement. There will be no opportunity for withdrawal. Chief Librarian Tigurius, pale from weeks of operating under the influence of the shadow and the warp, spoke with quiet determination. The psychic assault must be perfectly coordinated with the physical attack. We'll have perhaps minutes between the moment we disrupt their command network and the moment they begin adapting countermeasures. The Void battle would begin with a concentrated attack by Admiral Wrath's heaviest ships, drawing the bio-fleet's attention and forcing them to commit their defensive organisms. Simultaneously, strike teams of Space Marines would conduct boarding actions against the largest bioships, targeting the synaptic control centers, while Imperial Psychers attempted to disrupt the Hive Mind's coordination from a distance. Captain Sicarius would lead the primary boarding force, taking volunteers from across all 4 Space Marine chapters in what everyone understood would likely be a suicide mission. The interior of a Tyranid bioship was an alien environment where every surface, every corridor, every chamber was alive and hostile to human intrusion. We'll have perhaps an hour inside those ships before the alien atmosphere becomes completely lethal, Captain Sicarius explained to his volunteers during their final briefing. Our objective is to reach the central nervous clusters and plant melta charges that will destroy the synaptic control organs. Success means the death of the Hive Mind's coordinating intelligence. Failure means the consumption of this entire star system. The volunteers who stepped forward represented the finest warriors from each chapter. Brother Sergeant Dacius of the Ultramarines, his left arm replaced with a bionic prosthetic following his injuries during the reactor facility mission. Brother Champion Mordrak of the Imperial Fists, a veteran of the Siege of Caudalis who had requested assignment to the most dangerous operation available. Captain Severus of the Aurora chapter, whose expertise in stealth operations made him invaluable for infiltrating the bioship's living corridors. The preparation for this final assault took 3 days, during which every available resource was dedicated to maximizing the chances of success. Master of the Forge Gaiax worked around the clock to modify the boarding craft, installing additional life support systems and protective measures against the corrosive atmosphere of the bioships. The chapter's apothecaries prepared specialized medical kits designed to treat exposure to alien toxins and biological contaminants. Most critically, the surviving librarians began a series of preparatory rituals designed to focus their psychic abilities for the crucial moment when they would attempt to disrupt the Hive Mind. Working under the constant pressure of the shadow and the warp, they practiced techniques that pushed their abilities to the very limits of endurance. We will have one opportunity, Chief Librarian Tigurius explained during their final preparation session. The moment the boarding teams make contact with the synaptic organisms, we must project our combined will into the Hive Mind's network. The feedback will be devastating. Some of us will not survive the attempt. The battle began at dawn on the 52nd day of the siege, as Admiral Wrath's fleet emerged from the shadow of Macragge's largest moon in full battle formation. The initial bombardment achieved tactical surprise, with the first volley striking the outer bioships before they could fully respond. Lance batteries and macro cannons, their targeting guided by weeks of accumulated intelligence, found their marks in the creature's feeding chambers and reproductive organs. 3 smaller bioships died in the opening minutes of the engagement, their massive forms convulsing in the void before going dark. But the Tyranids' response was swift and terrible. The surviving bioships disgorged clouds of fighter organisms, living creatures the size of interceptor craft that swarmed toward the Imperial fleet with predatory hunger. Simultaneously, the largest bioships began launching boarding spores toward the Imperial vessels, seeking to turn the boarding action into a mutual exchange of invasions. The void between the fleets became a maelstrom of violence, as Imperial fighters engaged the Tyranid flying organisms in desperate dogfights among the wreckage of destroyed vessels. The alien creatures proved to be formidable opponents, their biological sensors allowing them to track Imperial craft with disturbing accuracy, while their natural weapons could penetrate even reinforced cockpit armor. Squadron leader Thorn of the 47th Fighter Wing distinguished herself during this engagement, developing tactics that exploited the creatures' biological nature, rather than treating them as conventional aircraft. They're predators, not machines. She transmitted to her fellow pilots. They respond to wounded prey. Use that against them. Her squadron began using damaged fighters as bait, drawing the creatures into ambushes where concentrated firepower could eliminate them efficiently. The tactic proved effective, but it came at a terrible cost in pilots and aircraft. Of the 60 fighters that had begun the engagement, fewer than 20 remained operational after the first hour of combat. Meanwhile, the boarding operation proceeded according to plan, despite the chaos of the void battle surrounding it. Captain Sicarius led his strike force aboard modified Thunderhawk gunships that had been equipped with specialized drilling equipment to penetrate the bioship's living hulls. The moment of breach was unlike anything the Space Marines had experienced. Instead of cutting through metal and ceramite, they were carving through flesh that screamed and bled and tried to heal itself around their cutting tools. Emperor preserve us, Brother Sergeant Dacius voxed as his team emerged into the first bioship's interior corridors. The walls are breathing. The floor is pulsing like a heartbeat. This entire ship is one massive organism. The first resistance came from the ship's immune system. Specialized organisms that emerged from hidden chambers in the walls and ceiling. These creatures were unlike the Tyranids that had been encountered on planetary surfaces, adapted specifically for combat in the cramped confines of the bioship's interior. They moved through the organic corridors with fluid grace, their forms perfectly suited to the curved passages and irregular chambers. Contact front, Captain Sicarius reported as his advance team encountered the first wave of shipboard defenders. Unknown organism type. Approximately human-sized but with enhanced mobility in confined spaces. Engaging with bolter fire, the boarding teams fought their way deeper into the bioship's interior, following navigation markers provided by the Ultramarines' most experienced tech marines, who had studied captured biosamples to understand the creature's anatomical structure. Their destination was the central nervous cluster, a massive organic brain that served as the local node in the Hive mind's network. The approach to this vital organ was heavily defended by increasingly sophisticated creatures that seemed to anticipate the Space Marines' tactics. The ship itself appeared to be learning from each engagement, spawning new defensive organisms that were specifically adapted to counter the intruder's capabilities. Brother Apothecary Cordius, monitoring the team's biological exposure levels, reported growing concern about the toxic environment. The atmospheric contamination is reaching critical levels. Even our enhanced physiology won't be able to cope with prolonged exposure. We have perhaps 30 minutes before the alien pathogens begin affecting motor function. The final approach to the nervous cluster required the boarding team to traverse a chamber that defied rational description. The space was filled with hanging tendrils that pulsed with electrical activity, while the floor was covered with a substance that appeared to be liquid neural tissue. Moving through this environment was like wading through the active brain of a living creature. I can hear it thinking, reported Epistolary Numerius of the Aurora chapter, who had volunteered for the boarding mission despite the risks to his psychic abilities. The hive mind is aware of our presence. It's trying to understand what we are, what we want. The curiosity is almost innocent. Captain Sicarius reached the central nervous cluster first, his power sword carving through the defensive organisms that swarmed to protect the vital organ. The sight that greeted him was both beautiful and terrible. A massive brain-like structure that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, clearly visible through translucent organic walls. This was the local intelligence that coordinated hundreds of thousands of Tyranid creatures across the system. Melta-charges placed, he reported as his team positioned the explosive devices around the cluster's vital points. Prepare for synaptic disruption. The results were immediately visible across the entire battle. Tyranid bioships that had been maneuvering with perfect coordination suddenly began drifting aimlessly, their weapon symbiotes firing randomly or not at all. Fighter organisms that had been engaged in complex tactical maneuvers reverted to simple attack patterns that made them easy prey for Imperial pilots. All ships concentrate fire on the largest remaining bioship, Admiral Wrath commanded as he recognized the opportunity created by the synaptic disruption. Target their command sections while they're unable to coordinate defensive actions. The Imperial fleet's concentrated bombardment against the disconnected bioships achieved results that had seemed impossible during the early phases of the war. Weapons that had previously been absorbed by adaptive armor now penetrated deep into vital organs. Bioships that had regenerated from massive damage began dying as their self-repair systems fell into chaos. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Captain Sicarius and his boarding team were trapped aboard the dying bioship as its internal systems began shutting down. The melta charges that had destroyed the nervous cluster had also triggered a cascade of biological failures that was turning the ship's interior into a toxic wasteland. Thunderhawk extraction impossible, reported the pilot of the boarding craft. The ship's hull is sealing all breach points as part of some kind of death reflex. We cannot reach the boarding team. Captain Sicarius made his final transmission as the bioship's death throes intensified around his team. Mission accomplished. Synaptic network disrupted. Tell the chapter that we died as Space Marines should, in service to the Emperor and in defense of humanity. But the boarding mission had achieved more than just tactical victory. The intelligence gathered during the penetration of the bioship, combined with the biological samples retrieved from the destroyed nervous clusters, provided unprecedented insight into Tyranid biology and behavior. This knowledge would prove invaluable in preparing for future encounters with Hive fleets. Chief Librarian Tigurius, though severely weakened by the psychic effort required for the assault, managed to compile a comprehensive report on the experience of touching the Hive mind directly. It is vast beyond imagination, he reported during his debriefing. A consciousness that spans light years, composed of billions of individual creatures all connected in a web of shared thought. But it is not malevolent in any way we would understand. It simply hungers, and to it, we are food. The final phase of the battle involved the systematic destruction of the remaining Tyranid organisms throughout the Macragge system. Cut off from the Hive mind's coordination, the creatures reverted to basic survival instincts that made them far easier to hunt down and eliminate. Strike teams composed of Space Marines and Imperial Guard conducted sweeping operations across the system's worlds, rooting out the last pockets of alien contamination. This cleanup phase lasted for several weeks and revealed the true extent of the damage that the invasion had caused. Entire worlds had been stripped of all biological matter, their atmospheres consumed, their oceans drained. The task of restoration would take decades, if it was possible at all. Master of the Forge Gaiax led survey teams to assess the biological contamination left behind by the Tyranid presence. His reports made sobering reading. Even worlds that had been only briefly occupied showed signs of deep ecological damage that might never be fully reversible. They don't just consume life, Gaiax explained in his comprehensive assessment. They consume the very possibility of life. The soil chemistry has been altered at the molecular level. The atmospheric composition has been changed. Even if we could restore the basic environmental conditions, it would take millennia for complex ecosystems to redevelop. Yet despite the massive destruction, the victory was complete. Hive fleet Behemoth had been stopped, its bioships destroyed, its ground forces eliminated. The first major Tyranid invasion had been defeated through a combination of tactical innovation, heroic sacrifice, and the kind of determination that had made the Space Marines the Emperor's finest warriors. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The Tyranids were not unstoppable. They could be understood, predicted, and ultimately defeated by human courage and ingenuity. The Great Devourer had been turned back, proving that even the most alien and terrible enemies could be overcome by those willing to pay the necessary price. In the weeks following the destruction of Hive fleet Behemoth, the true cost of victory became apparent to those who had survived the ordeal. Chapter Master Calgar stood in the ruins of what had once been the great chapel of the Fortress of Hera, its soaring arches now exposed to Macragge's alien-tainted sky, its sacred windows shattered by the violence of orbital bombardment. The Ultramarines chapter had been reduced to barely 300 battle brothers, a catastrophic loss that represented the near destruction of one of the Imperium's most honored Space Marine chapters. Of the 10 companies that had begun the war, only fragments remained. The first company, which had traditionally numbered 100 Terminator armored veterans, could muster only 37 survivors. The devastation extended beyond mere numbers. Irreplaceable gene seed, ancient equipment, and millennia of accumulated knowledge had been lost in the fighting. "We have paid a price that will echo through the centuries," Calgar confided to Chief Librarian Tigurius during one of their daily strategy sessions in the temporary command center that had been established in the fortress's deepest bunkers. "Our chapter will require decades to return to full strength if such a thing is even possible." The chapter master's own injuries served as a stark reminder of the battle's intensity. The wounds he had suffered during his duel with the creature that Imperial scholars would later classify as a Swarmlord had required extensive surgical reconstruction. His left arm had been replaced with a master-crafted bionic limb, while his torso bore the scars of talons that had penetrated even his ancient Terminator armor. Yet even in the midst of such devastation, the work of rebuilding had already begun. The surviving Space Marines threw themselves into the task of restoration with the same determination they had shown in battle. Temporary facilities were established to continue the process of recruiting and training new battle brothers, while the chapter's apothecaries worked tirelessly to preserve and cultivate the gene seed of the fallen. Master of the Forge Gaiax faced perhaps the most daunting challenge of all: the restoration of the chapter's equipment and infrastructure. The armory had been breached during the siege, resulting in the loss of weapons and armor that had served the chapter for thousands of years. Ancient suits of Terminator armor, master-crafted weapons blessed by the Emperor himself, irreplaceable relics of the Great Crusade, all had been consumed by the alien hunger. "We must rebuild not just our strength, but our identity," Kayaks explained to his small team of surviving tech marines. "Every weapon we forge, every suit of armor we craft, must carry forward the memory of what we have lost while serving the needs of what we must become." The process of psychological recovery proved as challenging as the physical reconstruction. Many of the surviving Space Marines exhibited symptoms that chapter chaplains had never encountered, a form of combat trauma specifically related to facing an enemy that viewed them as nothing more than food. The existential horror of confronting creatures that sought not conquest or corruption, but complete biological absorption, had left deep psychological scars. Chaplain Cassius adapted his spiritual counseling techniques to address these new challenges, developing rituals and meditations that helped battle brothers process their experiences while maintaining their dedication to the Emperor's service. His work during this period would later be compiled into the Catechisms of Endurance, spiritual texts that became standard resources for Space Marines who had faced Tyranid forces. "We have looked into the face of extinction itself," Cassius addressed the assembled survivors during one of his regular prayer services. "We have seen what awaits our species if we falter in our duty. But we have also proven that even the Great Devourer can be turned back by faith, courage, and the righteous fury of the Emperor's chosen." The civilian population of the Ultramar sector had suffered losses that defied easy calculation. Entire worlds had been consumed, their populations reduced to raw biomass for the alien war machine. Conservative estimates suggested that over 15 billion Imperial citizens had perished during the invasion, while millions more bore the psychological scars of having witnessed the consumption of everything they had known and loved. Governor Ix of Kalth, who had survived the evacuation that he had initially opposed, took charge of the massive refugee resettlement program. Millions of displaced civilians needed to be housed, fed, and eventually integrated into new communities on worlds that had been spared the worst of the invasion. "We are not simply relocating populations," Governor Ix explained during a sector-wide administrative conference. "We are preserving the cultural heritage of worlds that no longer exist. Every refugee carries with them the memory of a lost homeland, and it is our duty to ensure that those memories are not allowed to fade." The economic impact of the invasion extended far beyond the immediate costs of reconstruction. The Ultramar sector had been one of the Imperium's most prosperous regions, its industrial output supporting military operations across multiple segmentums. The loss of manufacturing capacity, combined with the disruption of trade routes and the displacement of skilled workers, created economic shockwaves that would be felt for decades. Yet even in the face of such challenges, the legendary efficiency of Ultramar's administration began to assert itself. Supply chains were rerouted, production facilities were rebuilt, and new trade agreements were negotiated with neighboring sectors. The resilience that had made the region prosperous in the first place proved crucial to its recovery. Admiral Wrath faced his own set of challenges in rebuilding the Ultramar defense fleet. The naval losses had been severe, with over 60% of the fleet's tonnage destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Many of the experienced officers and crew members who had formed the backbone of the fleet's effectiveness had perished during the void battles. "We must learn from our losses while building for the future," Admiral Wrath explained to the Naval Command Staff during their first comprehensive strategy session after the battle. "The tactics that served us well against conventional enemies proved inadequate against biological ships. We need new doctrines, new equipment, and new training programs that account for the unique challenges of fighting living vessels." The development of these new naval doctrines became a priority that extended far beyond the Ultramar sector. The intelligence gathered during the void battles against Hive fleet Behemoth was compiled into comprehensive tactical manuals that were distributed throughout the Imperial Navy. For the first time, human naval officers had detailed information about how to fight and defeat bioships. Captain Helena Voss, who had survived the destruction of her cruiser and been rescued by Imperial search teams, became one of the leading experts on anti-Tyranid void warfare. Her innovative tactics had proven crucial to the fleet's eventual victory, and her experience became the foundation for new training programs throughout the Navy. "Fighting bioships requires us to think like hunters rather than soldiers," Captain Voss explained during a lecture at the Naval Academy on Mars. "These are not machines to be disabled, but creatures to be killed. We must target their vital organs, disrupt their life processes, and prevent them from healing the damage we inflict." The research revealed disturbing insights into the scope of the Tyranid threat. Analysis of genetic materials suggested that the creatures had consumed life forms from hundreds of different worlds during their journey to the galaxy. Each world's biological heritage had been incorporated into their genetic database, making them a repository of evolutionary adaptations that spanned millions of years. "They are not simply a single species," reported Magos biologist Kane during a presentation to the Imperial Senate on Terra. "They are a collective organism that has absorbed the genetic heritage of countless civilizations." This revelation had profound implications for Imperial strategy. If the Tyranids could incorporate the genetic advantages of every species they encountered, then each victory would make them more dangerous opponents for future encounters. The challenge was not simply to defeat individual Hive fleets, but to prevent them from gaining access to new biological material that could enhance their capabilities. The development of planetary sterilization protocols became a grim necessity. Worlds that were certain to fall to Tyranid attack would be subjected to exterminatus rather than allowed to provide biomass for the alien war machine. It was a harsh decision that would condemn billions of Imperial citizens to death, but the alternative, allowing the Tyranids to grow stronger, was deemed unacceptable. The psychological impact of these protocols extended throughout Imperial society. Citizens who had once viewed their worlds as permanent homes now lived with the knowledge that their own government might destroy them rather than allow them to be consumed by aliens. The existential dread that had previously been confined to frontier regions began to spread throughout the galaxy. Chief Librarian Tigurius's research into the nature of the hive mind provided equally disturbing insights. His direct contact with the alien consciousness during the psychic assault had revealed the true scope of the threat facing humanity. The creatures were not simply an invasion force. They were the advanced elements of something far larger. The hive mind that controlled Behemoth was itself merely a fragment of something greater. Tigurius reported during a closed session with the Ultramarines command staff. "During our psychic contact, I sensed the presence of other fleets, other invasions, other hungry consciousnesses moving through the void between galaxies. What we faced here was not unique. It was the first of many." This intelligence was immediately transmitted to Terra, where it prompted a fundamental reassessment of Imperial defense priorities. The Tyranid threat was not a localized problem that could be contained within a single sector. It was a galaxy-wide crisis that would require unprecedented levels of coordination and resource allocation. The High Lords of Terra authorized the creation of new military formations specifically designed to combat Tyranid invasions. The Death Watch, an elite organization that drew its members from across the Adeptus Astartes, was tasked with developing specialized anti-Xenos capabilities. New Imperial Guard regiments were formed with equipment and training specifically adapted for fighting biological enemies. Perhaps most significantly, the Ordo Xenos of the Imperial Inquisition received vast new resources and authority to investigate and combat the Tyranid threat. Inquisitors began establishing monitoring stations throughout the galaxy, watching for the early signs of Hive fleet approach that might provide enough warning for effective defensive preparations. The Cathedral of Remembrance, built on the site of the destroyed Hera city, became a pilgrimage destination for Imperial citizens seeking to understand the nature of the threat facing humanity. Its walls bore the names of every known victim of the invasion, while its archives contained detailed accounts of the battle that could serve as both memorial and tactical manual for future generations. But perhaps the most important legacy of the First Tyrannic War was the proof it provided that the Tyranids could be defeated. The tactics developed during the campaign, rapid adaptation, synapse targeting, psychic disruption, became the foundation for Imperial anti-Tyranid doctrine. The courage shown by the defenders of Macragge inspired similar determination throughout the galaxy. We have learned that no enemy, no matter how alien or terrible, is truly invincible. Chapter Master Calgar declared during the memorial service for the fallen. The price of victory may be high, but the alternative, the extinction of everything we hold sacred, is unacceptable. We will remember the dead by ensuring that their sacrifice enables the living to survive what is yet to come. The reconstruction of the Ultramarines chapter became a model for other Space Marine chapters that would face similar challenges in future campaigns. New recruitment protocols were developed to accelerate the creation of battle brothers, while revised training programs incorporated lessons learned from fighting biological enemies. The chapter's gene seed, preserved through the careful work of the surviving apothecaries, became the foundation for new generations of Space Marines who would carry forward both the tactical knowledge and the determination that had made victory possible. Each new battle brother was inducted not just into the chapter's traditions, but into its legacy of resistance against the Great Devourer. As the months passed and the immediate crisis faded into history, the true significance of the First Tyrannic War became apparent. It had been more than just a military victory. It had been humanity's first successful defense against an existential threat. The species that had once seemed invincible had been proven vulnerable, and the galaxy had learned that even the Great Devourer could be turned back by courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable will to survive. The war was over, but the knowledge it had provided would shape humanity's response to the alien threat for millennia to come. The heroes of Macragge had paid the ultimate price to ensure that their species would know how to fight the next invasion when it came. And everyone understood that it would come again. 3 months after the final destruction of Hive fleet Behemoth's remnants, Scout Sergeant Telion received orders that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of the Tyranid threat. Telion had served the chapter for over 2 centuries. His skills in stealth and observation honed through countless campaigns across the galaxy. He had tracked orc warbands through the ash wastes of Mordian, hunted chaos cultists in the underhives of Necromunda, and stalked Eldar rangers through the crystal forests of distant Maiden worlds. Yet as his strike cruiser Silent Stalker approached the system's edge, he carried with him a sense of unease that had nothing to do with his immediate mission. The long-range Auspex arrays that had been hastily installed throughout the Ultramar sector were detecting anomalous readings from the void beyond the galaxy's edge. Initially dismissed as sensor ghosts or the lingering psychic echoes of the destroyed Hive fleet, these signals had grown stronger and more coherent over the past weeks. Chief Librarian Tigurius had insisted that they warranted investigation, despite the demands of reconstruction that kept most of the chapter's resources focused on Macragge itself. "There's something out there," Tigurius had confided to Telion during their final briefing. "I can feel it in the warp. A presence that reminds me of what we faced during the siege, but larger, much larger." Scout Brother Naaman, Telion's most trusted subordinate, monitored these hybrid sensors as the strike cruiser pushed deeper into the void beyond Macragge's outer planets. For hours, the readings remained within normal parameters, the usual background radiation of space, punctuated by the occasional debris field left behind by the recent battles. Then, at the very edge of their sensor range, the readings changed. "Sergeant," Naaman reported, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "you need to see this." The display that greeted Telion defied immediate comprehension. The sensors were detecting massive objects at the edge of their range, objects that registered as biological in nature, but possessed a scale that dwarfed even the largest ships of Hive fleet Behemoth. The readings suggested creatures the size of small moons, moving through the void with the same purposeful intelligence that had characterized the recent invasion. "How many contacts?" Telion asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'm reading Thousands, Sergeant. Possibly tens of thousands. The sensor returns are so massive that individual contacts are merging together. It's like looking at a biological nebula that spans light years. Telian ordered the silent stalker to maintain position while he processed the implications of what they were observing. The destruction of Hive Fleet Behemoth had been celebrated throughout the Imperium as a decisive victory over the Tyranid threat, but these sensor readings suggested that Behemoth had been merely the first wave of something far larger. "Launch a reconnaissance probe," he ordered. "I want detailed scans of whatever's out there, but maintain maximum stealth protocols. If those things detect our presence..." The probe's journey to the edge of the sensor contacts took 18 hours, during which Telian and his team maintained strict communications silence. The data it transmitted back during its final moments would haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. "Emperor preserve us," Scout Brother Naaman whispered as he processed the reconnaissance data. "That's not an invasion fleet. That's an entire civilization on the move." The probe's bioscanners had detected something even more disturbing than the sheer number of approaching fleets. The creatures within these fleets showed genetic markers that indicated they had consumed life forms from dozens of different galaxies during their journey across the intergalactic void. Each Hive fleet carried within its biological database the evolutionary heritage of entire cosmic regions. Telian immediately transmitted his findings back to Macragge, using the highest priority communications codes available to the chapter. The implications were too significant to be delayed by normal military protocol. Within hours, his data was being studied by the most senior officers of the Ultramarines and their allied chapters. Chapter Master Calgar received the intelligence while overseeing the reconstruction of the Fortress Monastery's East Wing. The wounds he had suffered during the siege had healed, but the weight of this new information seemed to age him visibly as he studied the reconnaissance images. "How long do we have?" he asked. Chief Librarian Tigurius, who had been analyzing the psychic emanations detected by the probe. "Based on their current approach vectors and the speed they're maintaining, the first of these new fleets will reach Imperial space within 5 to 10 years, Tigurius replied. "But that assumes they maintain their current pace. If they accelerate their approach once they detect the remains of Behemoth..." The sentence hung unfinished in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. The victory over Hive Fleet Behemoth had been achieved at enormous cost, reducing the Ultramarines to a fraction of their former strength and devastating the entire Ultramar sector. The prospect of facing dozens of similar invasions with depleted resources in a galaxy that was still recovering from the First War seemed almost insurmountable. Admiral Wrath, who had been summoned from the orbital shipyards where he was overseeing the construction of new vessels, studied the tactical implications with the eye of a veteran naval officer. "We can't fight them the same way we fought Behemoth," he concluded. "We simply don't have the resources to repeat that kind of defensive campaign on multiple fronts simultaneously." The intelligence was immediately transmitted to Terra via the fastest astropathic relays available. The High Lords of Terra received Talian's reconnaissance data within days, and their response was swift and comprehensive. New defense initiatives were authorized, emergency military production was ordered, and diplomatic overtures were made to every human world in the galaxy. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Deep within the archives of the Imperial Palace, ancient records were consulted that dated back to the earliest days of the Imperium. Scholars and adepts working under direct orders from the Emperor's own representatives discovered fragmentary references to similar threats that had been faced by humanity's predecessors. "Your species faces the same choice that has confronted every intelligent civilization in this galaxy," Farseer Eldrad Ulthron communicated through a series of carefully arranged meetings with Imperial representatives. "You can fight and die as most do, or you can adapt and survive through methods that your current understanding cannot encompass." The Eldar's willingness to share intelligence about the Tyranid threat reflected their own desperate situation. Their dying race could not survive another galaxy-wide consumption event, and they recognized that humanity's survival might be their only hope of maintaining some form of resistance against the approaching fleets. The information provided by the Eldar painted a picture of the Tyranid species that was both more comprehensive and more terrifying than anything Imperial scholars had previously imagined. The creatures were not simply an aggressive species seeking to expand their territory, they were a force of nature that had evolved specifically to consume entire galaxies. Their life cycle operated on cosmic timescales, with individual hive fleets spending millions of years traveling between galaxies, while their populations remained in a state of suspended animation. Upon reaching a new galaxy, they would begin the systematic consumption of all biological matter, using the accumulated biomass to reproduce and eventually split into multiple fleets that would seek out new targets. They are the ultimate expression of evolution, Eldrad explained during one of the diplomatic sessions. Every species they encounter, every world they consume, every form of life they absorb makes them more perfect predators. They have consumed entire galaxies and incorporated the genetic heritage of billions of species into their collective consciousness. This revelation fundamentally changed Imperial strategy regarding the Tyranid threat. The traditional approach of meeting each invasion with military force was revealed to be ultimately futile, even if individual hive fleets could be defeated. The losses incurred in such victories would weaken humanity's ability to resist subsequent invasions. New strategic doctrines began to emerge that emphasized preservation of imperial strength rather than the defense of territory. Contingency plans were developed for the evacuation of entire sectors, while research programs were initiated to develop weapons and tactics that could achieve decisive victories with minimal resource expenditure. The Death Watch, that elite organization of Space Marines dedicated to combating Xenos threats, received massive new allocations of resources and personnel. Their mission expanded beyond simple military operations to include long-term strategic planning for a conflict that might span centuries. Inquisitor Cryptmen of the Ordo Xenos emerged as one of the leading experts on Tyranid biology and behavior. We cannot defeat them through conventional warfare, Cryptmen argued during a presentation to the High Lords of Terra. We must find ways to turn their own biology against them, to make the act of consuming Imperial worlds more costly than beneficial to their overall strategic goals. This philosophy led to the development of some of the most controversial policies in Imperial history. Worlds that could not be defended would be subjected to controlled ecological warfare, their biospheres poisoned with toxins that would contaminate any Tyranid organisms that consumed them. Entire star systems would be mined with automated weapon platforms that could continue fighting long after their human defenders had been evacuated. The psychological impact of these preparations was significant throughout Imperial society. Citizens who had celebrated the victory over Hive Fleet Behemoth now learned that their triumph had been merely the first battle in a war that might last for millennia. The existential threat represented by the approaching Hive fleets created a sense of urgency that permeated every aspect of Imperial culture. Religious movements emerged that interpreted the Tyranid invasion as a test of humanity's faith, while military recruitment reached levels not seen since the height of the Great Crusade. The knowledge that extinction was a real possibility motivated unprecedented levels of cooperation between different factions within the Imperium. Scout Sergeant Tyran, whose reconnaissance mission had revealed the true scope of the threat, found himself at the center of intense debriefings and strategic planning sessions. His first-hand observations of the approaching Hive fleets made him one of the few individuals who truly understood the magnitude of what humanity was facing. The final element of the intelligence gathered by Tyran's mission was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Analysis of the biosignatures detected by the reconnaissance probe suggested that the approaching Hive fleets had learned from the defeat of Behemoth. Their biological composition showed adaptations that appeared to be specifically designed to counter the tactics that had proven effective during the Macragge campaign. "They're coming prepared for us this time," Chief Librarian Tigurius observed during the final intelligence briefing. "Every success we achieved against Behemoth has been analyzed and countered. The next invasion will face defenders who have learned from experience, but it will be conducted by attackers who have also learned from experience." This realization prompted a fundamental shift in Imperial defensive planning. Rather than relying on the tactics that had proven successful against Behemoth, military planners began developing entirely new approaches that the Tyranids would not have encountered before. The element of surprise, which had been crucial to humanity's previous victory, would need to be recreated through constant innovation and adaptation. The greater threat had been revealed and its scope exceeded humanity's worst nightmares. But the species that had survived 10,000 years of warfare against impossible odds began preparing for what might be its ultimate test. The victory at Macragge had proven that the Tyranids could be defeated, but the intelligence gathered by Scout Sergeant Tyran made it clear that such victories would need to be repeated again and again against ever more dangerous opponents, with stakes that grew higher with each encounter. The First Tyrannic War had ended, but it had revealed itself to be merely the opening engagement in a conflict that would determine the fate of all life in the galaxy. In the quiet hours before dawn on Macragge, when the alien-tainted sky began to show the first hints of light, Chapter Master Marneus Calgar would often walk the perimeter of the rebuilt fortress monastery. His footsteps echoed through corridors that had been reconstructed stone by stone, past chambers where new generations of Space Marines trained for battles that their predecessors could never have imagined. The fortress bore scars that would never fully heal. Blast marks from bioplasma weapons had been incorporated into new wall designs rather than erased, serving as permanent reminders of the price that had been paid for humanity's survival. The names of the fallen were carved into black marble throughout the complex, their memory preserved not as abstract sacrifice, but as a living part of the chapter's identity. 5 years had passed since Scout Sergeant T-Line's reconnaissance mission had revealed the true scope of the Tyranid threat, and those years had been filled with preparation on a scale that dwarfed even the mobilization that had preceded the First Tyrannic War. Across the galaxy, humanity prepared for invasions that would make the assault on Macragge seem modest by comparison. The Ultramarines had been rebuilt to full strength through an intensive recruitment and training program that had transformed the chapter's approach to warfare. New battle brothers learned not just the traditional arts of war, but specialized techniques for fighting biological enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything in previous Imperial experience. Veterans who had survived the siege of Macragge served as instructors, passing on hard-won knowledge to warriors who would face even greater challenges. Brother Dreadnought Invictus had become one of the chapter's most valued assets during this period of reconstruction. His experiences during the siege, preserved within the mechanical shell that now housed his consciousness, provided insights that could not be found in any tactical manual. Young Space Marines would spend hours listening to his accounts of battles against creatures that seemed to defy every law of warfare. The reconstruction of the Ultramar sector had proceeded with efficiency that impressed even the administratum officials who oversaw the project. New defensive installations had been built on every inhabited world, while early warning systems provided coverage that extended far beyond the sector's traditional boundaries. The lessons learned during the siege had been incorporated into every aspect of the regional defense network. Governor Ix of Calth had become one of the Imperium's leading experts on managing populations under the threat of Tyranid invasion. His protocols for rapid evacuation and resource preservation had been adopted throughout the galaxy, providing civilian administrators with practical guidance for situations that previous generations had never needed to consider. We learned that survival sometimes requires sacrificing what we love in order to preserve what we cherish, Governor Ix explained during a sector conference on emergency preparedness. Buildings can be rebuilt, equipment can be replaced, but the human spirit, the courage and determination that allowed us to survive, that must be preserved at all costs. The civilian population of the Ultramar sector carried their own scars from the invasion. Entire generations of children had grown up with the knowledge that their world had been consumed and regurgitated by alien creatures, that their families had survived only through the sacrifice of others, and that such horrors might return at any time. Yet these psychological wounds had also produced a strength that surprised even the Space Marines who protected them. The children of refugees showed levels of determination and resilience that exceeded anything in Imperial records. They understood, in ways that previous generations had not, that their existence was precious precisely because it was fragile. Magos biologist Kane had spent the years since the invasion studying the biological samples that had been recovered from the destroyed Hive fleet. His research had revealed the true elegance and terror of Tyranid evolution, a biological system so perfect in its adaptation that it bordered on the supernatural. They represent the ultimate expression of natural selection, Kane reported during one of his regular presentations to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Every encounter makes them more perfect predators. Every victory provides them with new genetic material to incorporate. Fighting them is like fighting evolution itself. Yet Kane's research had also revealed weaknesses that offered hope for humanity's survival. These discoveries had led to the development of new weapons and tactics that showed promise in laboratory testing, biological warfare agents that could disrupt Tyranid reproduction, psychic techniques that could interfere with hive mind coordination, and even exotic weapons that could target the quantum structures that allowed the creatures to maintain their perfect genetic integrity. Chief Librarian Tigurius had recovered from the psychic trauma of his contact with the hive mind, but the experience had changed him in ways that were visible to anyone who knew him well. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had touched something vast and alien, and his eyes carried knowledge that would have driven lesser minds to madness. "I have seen the future," he confided to Chapter Master Calgar during one of their evening discussions. "Not a specific future, but the shape of what is to come. This galaxy will know war such as it has never experienced. Species will rise and fall, worlds will burn, and the very fabric of reality will be tested. But through it all, humanity will endure. We will adapt, we will learn, and we will survive." The intelligence networks that had been established following Tyran's discovery continued to monitor the approach of the new Hive fleets. Their progress through the intergalactic void was slow but inexorable, each passing month bringing them closer to the galaxy's edge. Conservative estimates suggested that the first of these new invasions would begin within the next 5 years. But humanity was no longer the same species that had faced Hive fleet Behemoth. The knowledge gained through blood and sacrifice had been disseminated throughout the Imperium, creating a level of preparedness that would have been impossible before the First Tyrannic War. New tactics, new weapons, new strategic doctrines, all had been developed and tested in preparation for the greater conflicts to come. The Space Marines who had survived the siege of Macragge had become the nucleus around which humanity's resistance would be built. Their experiences, their knowledge, and their unshakable determination provided the foundation for military preparations that spanned the entire galaxy. Captain Saul, whose name had been inscribed on the chapter's roll of honor following his sacrifice aboard the bio ship, was remembered not just as a hero but as a symbol of the kind of courage that would be required in the battles ahead. His final transmission, "Mission accomplished. Tell the chapter that we died as Space Marines should," had become a rallying cry for warriors throughout the Imperium. The memorial services held each year on the anniversary of the siege's end had evolved into something more than simple remembrance ceremonies. They became opportunities for the survivors to share their knowledge with new generations, to pass on the lessons that had been learned through such terrible cost. "We do not mourn the dead," Chaplain Cassius would intone during these ceremonies, his voice carrying across assembled crowds that numbered in the millions. "We honor them by ensuring that their sacrifice was not in vain. Every day we survive, every victory we achieve, every world we save from the alien hunger. All of this is possible because of what they gave for the Emperor and for humanity." The broader Imperium had been transformed by the knowledge of the approaching threat. Military production had reached levels not seen since the Horus Heresy, while diplomatic initiatives had created alliances between human worlds that had been isolated for millennia. New Space Marine chapters had been created specifically to combat the Tyranid threat, their gene seed drawn from the heroic lineages that had proven most effective against biological enemies, the Death Specters, the Scythes of the Emperor, the Iron Hand successors. All had been equipped and trained according to doctrines that had been written in the blood of Macragge's defenders. The Imperial Guard had undergone similar transformations, with entire regiments being retrained and re-equipped for warfare against biological enemies. The Catachan jungle fighters, with their expertise in fighting dangerous creatures, had become templates for anti-Tyranid formations throughout the galaxy. Yet perhaps the most significant change had been psychological. The people of the Imperium no longer viewed their galaxy as a secure fortress that could be defended through conventional means. They understood that they faced an enemy that threatened not just conquest, but complete extinction. This knowledge had produced a unity of purpose that transcended traditional boundaries between different factions of Imperial society. As Chapter Master Calgar completed his dawn patrol of the Fortress Monastery, he paused at the memorial wall where the names of the fallen were inscribed in letters of gold. Each name represented not just an individual loss, but a lesson learned, a tactic developed, a weakness discovered in the alien enemy. Brother Captain Saul Invictus, whose sacrifice had saved the fortress's power systems. Scout Brother Maximus, who had provided crucial intelligence about Tyranid tunnel networks. Sergeant Taurus, whose technical expertise had enabled the first successful boarding actions against bioships. Hundreds of names, thousands of stories, all part of humanity's growing understanding of how to fight an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The morning light revealed the bustling activity of a chapter that had been reborn through adversity. New battle brothers practiced combat drills that incorporated lessons learned from fighting biological enemies. Tech Marines worked on weapon systems that had been designed specifically to counter Tyranid adaptations. Chaplains conducted services that honored both the Emperor and the heroes whose sacrifice had made survival possible. In the distance, the orbital shipyards that Admiral Wrath had established were visible as points of light against the alien sky. New vessels were taking shape in those facilities. Ships designed according to principles that had been learned through desperate void battles against living opponents. The Imperial Navy that would face the next invasion would be fundamentally different from the one that had struggled against Hive fleet Behemoth. The approaching Hive fleets represented a threat of unprecedented magnitude, but they would not be facing the same humanity that had barely survived the First Tyrannic War. The Great Devourer had taught humanity that survival required constant evolution, endless adaptation, and the willingness to pay any price for continued existence. But humanity had taught the Great Devourer something equally important: that some species refuse to be consumed quietly, that some prey fights back with intelligence and determination that can overcome even perfect biological adaptation. The endless war had begun with the first spore that fell on Tyran, and it would continue until either humanity learned to coexist with the cosmic predator, or one species completely eliminated the other. But in the quiet moments before dawn on Macragge, surrounded by the evidence of human resilience and the memory of heroic sacrifice, it was possible to believe that the species that had survived 10,000 years of warfare might yet find a way to survive 10,000 more. The First Tyrannic War had ended, but its legacy would echo through eternity, not as humanity's moment of greatest peril, but as the crucible in which the species had learned what it truly meant to fight for survival against the vast, hungry darkness between the stars. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war, but there was also hope, courage, and the indomitable will of those who refused to surrender to extinction. The heroes of Macragge had shown the way forward, and their example would guide humanity through whatever trials lay ahead in the endless night. The Emperor protects, but only those who are willing to protect themselves. In the years that followed the revelation of the greater Tyranid threat, a new tradition emerged among the survivors of the First Tyrannic War. They called it the Silent Vigil, a practice of quiet contemplation that took place during the darkest hours of each night, when the alien-touched sky of Macragge was at its blackest, and the stars seemed most distant. Brother Sergeant Ultramarines, the sole survivor of Captain Invictus's final mission, had been the first to begin this practice. His injuries from the reactor facility had healed, but the memories of those irradiated depths remained vivid in his enhanced consciousness. Each night, he would climb to the highest tower of the rebuilt fortress monastery, where he could look out across the scarred landscape that had once been consumed by alien hunger. Others began to join him. Veterans who had stood with him in the tunnels beneath the fortress, Space Marines who had lost battle brothers during the siege, and even civilian survivors who had been touched by the horror of watching their world be devoured. They would gather in silence, not speaking, not praying aloud, simply bearing witness to the darkness and remembering what had been lost. "We are the guardians of memory," Ultramarines would sometimes say to those who asked about the vigil. "Every night that passes brings the enemy closer, but it also carries us further from the moment of our greatest trial. We must not allow ourselves to forget what we learned, what we sacrificed, what we became." Chief Librarian Tigurius often joined these vigils, though his participation was different from the others. While they remembered the past, he looked toward the future with his psychic abilities, sensing the slow approach of the Hive fleets through the vast emptiness between galaxies. His consciousness would stretch across the void, touching the edge of that vast alien hunger that moved inexorably toward their galaxy. "I can feel them out there," he confided to Chapter Master Calgar during one of these nocturnal watches. "Not their individual thoughts. The hive mind is too alien for that, but their purpose. It burns like a cold fire in the darkness, patient and eternal. They have time in ways that we do not. They can wait centuries for the perfect moment to strike." The knowledge that their enemy possessed such patience had profound implications for Imperial strategy. Human military doctrine was based on the assumption that enemies would act within timeframes that mortals could comprehend. But the Tyranids operated on geological timescales, willing to spend decades or even centuries positioning themselves for optimal attacks. This realization led to changes in how the Imperium approached long-term planning. Military installations were designed to remain functional for centuries without human oversight. Automated defense systems were programmed with strategies that could adapt to changing circumstances over extended periods. Most significantly, protocols were established for maintaining institutional knowledge across generations of defenders. The Ultramarines became pioneers in developing these long-term defensive strategies. Their adherence to the Codex Astartes had always emphasized careful planning and systematic preparation. But the Tyranid threat required them to think beyond the traditional scope of military campaigns. They began planning for wars that might last for millennia, conflicts that would be inherited by space marines who had not yet been recruited from worlds that had not yet been discovered. Brother Dreadnought Invictus played a crucial role in this extended planning process. His mechanical form would endure far longer than organic life, making him a repository of knowledge that could survive for thousands of years. The chapter began recording detailed tactical databases within his consciousness, ensuring that future generations would have access to first-hand accounts of fighting the Great Devourer. "I have become a living archive," Invictus observed, during one of the strategy sessions that had become routine in the fortress monastery. "My memories of the siege will endure long after my organic brothers have passed into the Emperor's service. It is both a privilege and a burden to carry such knowledge." The civilian population of the Ultramar sector had developed their own responses to the knowledge of the approaching threat. Children who had grown up during the Reconstruction learned skills that previous generations had never needed: how to identify the early signs of Tyranid infestation, how to conduct rapid evacuations of entire cities, how to survive in hostile environments while alien predators hunted them. These skills were not taught as military training, but as basic life education, similar to reading or mathematics. Every child in the sector could recognize the distinctive psychic emanations that preceded a Tyranid invasion, could operate emergency communication equipment, and understood the protocols for biological decontamination. The psychological impact of this education was significant. Children who grew up knowing that extinction was a constant possibility developed a resilience and determination that impressed even hardened space marines. They did not live in fear, but rather with a heightened appreciation for the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting their communities. Master of the Forge Gaiax had spent the years since the invasion developing new technologies specifically designed for long-term resistance against biological enemies. His workshops had become laboratories where the boundaries between conventional engineering and biological science were constantly challenged. "We must learn to think like our enemies," Gaiax explained to his technical staff during one of their regular innovation sessions. "They adapt and evolve. We must build systems that can do the same. Static defenses will fail against an enemy that can modify its biology to overcome any obstacle." This philosophy led to the development of adaptive weapon systems that could modify their function based on the type of Tyranid organisms they encountered. Ammunition that could alter its composition in real time, armor that could strengthen itself in response to specific threats, vehicles that could reconfigure themselves for different battlefield roles. The most ambitious of these projects was the creation of semi-autonomous defense networks that could continue fighting even if their human operators were killed or evacuated. These systems used machine spirit technology enhanced with biological components salvaged from defeated Tyranid organisms, creating hybrid intelligences that could think like both human tacticians and alien predators. Admiral Wrath's shipyards had become testing grounds for revolutionary naval technologies. The lessons learned from fighting bioships had led to fundamental changes in Imperial naval architecture. New vessels were designed with multiple redundant systems that could continue functioning even after suffering massive biological contamination. "The enemy taught us that a ship is more than just weapons and armor," Admiral Wrath explained during a presentation to the Naval Academy on Mars. "It's a living system with vulnerabilities that can be exploited by biological weapons. We must design our vessels to be as adaptable as the creatures we fight." This new approach to shipbuilding emphasized modularity and redundancy over raw firepower. Vessels could be reconfigured for different types of missions. Their internal systems could be isolated to prevent biological contamination from spreading, and their crews could continue fighting even if large sections of the ship were compromised. The most innovative development was the creation of living ships vessels that incorporated carefully controlled biological components that could repair damage and adapt to new threats. These hybrid vessels were controversial within the Adeptus Mechanicus, as they challenged fundamental doctrines about the purity of Imperial technology. but their effectiveness against Tyranid bioships was undeniable. The intelligence networks that monitored the approach of the new Hive fleets had evolved into something resembling a galaxy-wide nervous system. Monitoring stations throughout Imperial space maintained constant surveillance of the void beyond the galaxy's edge, while psychers stationed at key points provided early warning of the psychic emanations that preceded Tyranid invasions. This network had detected subtle changes in the approaching Hive fleets that suggested they were indeed adapting their strategies based on the defeat of Behemoth. The biosignatures of the new fleets showed genetic modifications that appeared to be specifically designed to counter the tactics that had proven effective during the First Tyrannic War. They are learning from our victory just as we learned from their invasion, Chief Librarian Tigurius reported during a strategic briefing. Each success we achieve teaches them something new about our capabilities. We face an enemy that grows stronger through defeat. This realization had led to the development of deception strategies designed to mislead the approaching Hive fleets about Imperial capabilities. The psychological warfare experts of the Officio Assassinorum had developed techniques for creating false memories in captured Tyranid organisms, feeding incorrect tactical information back into the Hive mind through carefully manipulated prisoners. These operations were extremely dangerous, as they required direct contact with alien intelligences that could corrupt human minds, but they offered the possibility of turning the Tyranid's own learning ability against them. Scout Sergeant Teline continued his long-range reconnaissance missions, pushing deeper into the void to gather intelligence about the approaching threat. His reports painted an increasingly detailed picture of an enemy that defied conventional understanding of military organization. "They're not just fleets," Teline reported during one of his regular briefings. "They're ecosystems. Each Hive fleet contains within itself the biological heritage of dozens of consumed galaxies. They carry with them the evolutionary advantages of species that achieved things we can barely imagine." This intelligence had profound implications for Imperial strategic planning. The approaching Hive fleets were not simply military forces. They were mobile biospheres that contained the accumulated knowledge and genetic heritage of cosmic civilizations. Defeating them would require more than military victory. It would require finding ways to prevent them from learning and adapting. These protocols were tested on abandoned worlds in the Eastern Fringe, creating dead zones that would provide no sustenance to approaching Hive fleets. The process was emotionally devastating for the Imperial personnel who carried it out, as they were essentially murdering entire biospheres to deny them to the enemy. "We are becoming destroyers of life in order to preserve life," observed Inquisitor Cripman during one of the Ordo Xenos briefings. "It is a philosophical paradox that challenges everything we believe about our duty to protect Imperial citizens. Yet the alternative, total extinction, makes such choices inevitable." The silent vigil continued each night, as survivors of the First Tyrannic War maintained their watch over the darkness. Their numbers had grown over the years, as new generations joined the tradition and carried forward the memory of humanity's first victory against the Great Devourer. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the alien sky began to show the first hints of light, these watchers would sometimes see shooting stars, debris from the ancient battle, still falling from orbit years after the invasion had ended. Each streak of light across the sky served as a reminder of the price that had been paid for survival and the vigilance that would be required to maintain it. The approaching Hive fleets represented a threat of unprecedented magnitude, but they would not find humanity unprepared. The lessons learned during the siege of Macragge had been transformed into a comprehensive strategy for species survival that spanned multiple generations and countless worlds. The silent vigil was more than just a memorial tradition. It was a promise that the darkness would never again catch humanity unaware. As the years passed, and the reconstruction of the Ultramar sector continued, a profound change began to settle over the survivors of the First Tyrannic War. It was not the peace of victory, for everyone understood that greater conflicts lay ahead, but rather the deeper tranquility that comes from having faced the ultimate test and emerged with one's honor intact. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar had aged in the years since the siege, not in body, for Space Marines aged slowly and his enhanced physiology remained strong, but in spirit. The weight of command during humanity's darkest hour had marked him in ways that were visible to those who knew him well. In the evenings, after the day's duties were complete and the fortress monastery had settled into its nighttime rhythms, Calgar would often walk the memorial gardens that had been planted where Hera City once stood. The alien contamination had finally been cleansed from the soil, and new life was beginning to take root. Flowers that bloomed in colors not seen before the invasion. Trees whose branches grew in patterns that seemed to reach toward the stars. Life finds a way, he would sometimes say to the companions who joined him on these walks. Even after such devastation, even after such consumption, life returns. Perhaps that is the real lesson of our war against the Great Devourer. Not that we learned to fight them, but that we learned what we were fighting for. The fortress monastery itself had become a place of pilgrimage for warriors throughout the galaxy. Space Marines from distant chapters would journey to Macragge to study the records of the siege, to train in the techniques that had proven effective against biological enemies, and to pay their respects to the fallen. The chapter's archives had been expanded to accommodate researchers from across the Imperium, all seeking to understand the lessons that had been written in blood and sacrifice. Brother Dreadnought Invictus had become the most sought-after instructor in these programs. His consciousness, preserved within the mechanical shell that now housed his essence, contained memories that were more valuable than any written manual. Young Space Marines would spend hours listening to his accounts, not just of battle tactics and weapon effectiveness, but of the psychological challenges involved in fighting an enemy that viewed them as nothing more than food. Fear is not weakness, Invictus would tell his students, his mechanical voice carrying the weight of centuries. Fear is intelligence recognizing danger. The Tyranid should be feared. Their capabilities are real. Their hunger is infinite. But fear can also be transcended through duty, through faith, and through the knowledge that some things are worth dying to protect. Chief Librarian Tigurius had found his own form of peace through his continued study of the psychic phenomenon known as the shadow and the warp. His direct contact with the Hive mind during the siege had left him fundamentally changed, but it had also provided him with insights that no other human possessed. He had learned to navigate the psychic null space that surrounded Tyranid forces, finding ways to maintain limited psychic abilities even under conditions that would render most psychers helpless. "I have touched the mind of the Great Devourer," he would tell the librarians who came to study under his guidance. "It is vast beyond comprehension, ancient beyond measure, and utterly alien to everything we understand about consciousness. Yet it is not evil in any way that we would recognize. It simply is, a force of nature that has evolved to consume galaxies. Understanding this does not make it less dangerous, but it helps us fight it more effectively." His research had led to the development of new psychic disciplines specifically designed for combating Tyranid forces. These techniques required years of training and carried significant risks, but they offered the possibility of disrupting hive mind coordination on a scale that conventional weapons could not achieve. The civilian population of the rebuilt sector had found their own ways of honoring the memory of the invasion while moving forward with their lives. New architectural styles had emerged that incorporated defensive features as aesthetic elements, creating buildings that were both beautiful and capable of serving as fortresses if necessary. Gardens were designed with escape routes and emergency shelters, while public spaces included facilities that could be quickly converted to support refugee populations. Governor Ix of Kalth had established schools throughout the sector that taught what he called survival wisdom, practical knowledge about living under the constant threat of extinction. These institutions were not military academies, but rather centers of learning that helped citizens understand their place in a galaxy where humanity faced enemies that sought their complete annihilation. "We must raise our children to be both dreamers and realists," Governor Ix explained during the dedication of one such school. "They must understand the beauty and wonder of existence while also comprehending the constant vigilance required to preserve it. This is not a burden we place upon them, but a gift. The knowledge that their lives have meaning precisely because they are part of something larger than themselves." Master of the Forge Gaiax had continued his technological innovations, but his work had taken on an almost artistic quality in recent years. The weapons and equipment produced in his workshops were not just functional, but elegant in their design, incorporating aesthetic elements that spoke to the human spirit as well as tactical requirements. He had begun to see his role not just as a creator of tools for war, but as a preserver of human culture through technology. "Every weapon we create carries within it some essence of human creativity," Gaiax would tell his apprentices as they worked together in the forge. "We fight not just with bolters and chainswords, but with the accumulated heritage of 10,000 years of human achievement. Our enemies may be able to adapt to our technology, but they cannot replicate the soul that goes into its creation. The memorial services that were held each year on the anniversary of the siege's end had evolved into celebrations of human resilience as much as remembrances of sacrifice. Survivors would share their stories with younger generations, not dwelling on the horror of the invasion but emphasizing the courage and determination that had made victory possible. Chaplain Cassius, now showing his advanced age despite his enhanced physiology, had become the keeper of these stories. His sermons during the anniversary services drew pilgrims from across the galaxy, all seeking to understand how ordinary humans had found the strength to face such overwhelming odds. "We did not win because we were stronger than our enemies," Cassius would remind his audiences. "We won because we refused to surrender what we held most dear. The Tyranids could consume our bodies, our worlds, even our memories, but they could not consume our faith, our love, or our determination to protect what we cherished. That is what made us truly human, and that is what will preserve us in the trials yet to come." Admiral Wrath had retired from active fleet command, but he remained as an advisor to the new generation of naval officers who would face the approaching Hive fleets. His experiences during the Void battles had become the foundation for Imperial anti-Tyranid naval doctrine, and his insights continued to influence ship design and tactical development throughout the galaxy. "The enemy taught us that Void warfare is not about destroying ships," Admiral Wrath would explain to the officers who studied under his guidance. "It is about disrupting ecosystems. Bioships are not vessels carrying crews. They are organisms that happen to move through space. Understanding this distinction is crucial to developing effective countermeasures." Scout Sergeant Taline continued his reconnaissance missions, but he had also taken on the role of training the next generation of scouts who would monitor the galaxy's borders for signs of Tyranid approach. His knowledge of alien behavior patterns had become legendary within the chapter, and his students were among the most skilled infiltrators and observers in the Imperium. Patience is the scout's greatest weapon. Taline would tell his trainees during their exercises in the restored wilderness areas around Macragge. "The enemy will reveal their weaknesses, but only to those who know how to watch and wait. Every creature, no matter how alien, follows patterns that can be learned and exploited. Our advantage lies not in our strength, but in our ability to observe and adapt." The approaching Hive fleets remained a constant presence in Imperial strategic planning, but their threat had been transformed from a source of paralyzing fear into a challenge that could be met with preparation and determination. The knowledge that humanity had defeated one such invasion provided confidence that future invasions could be similarly overcome. Long-range monitoring stations continued to track the alien fleets as they moved through the intergalactic void, but these observations were now conducted with scientific curiosity as much as military necessity. Imperial scholars had begun to understand the Tyranids not just as enemies, but as a phenomenon of cosmic evolution that offered insights into the nature of life itself. "They are evolution perfected," observed Magos Biologus Kane during one of his presentations to the Adeptus Mechanicus. "Every adaptation, every biological innovation, every genetic modification has been tested and refined over millions of years. In a strange way, they represent the ultimate expression of the Omnissiah's will, perfect biological machinery that serves its function without question or hesitation." This perspective had led to controversial research programs that sought to understand Tyranid biology not for the purpose of destroying it, but for the insights it might provide into the nature of life itself. Such research was carefully controlled and monitored, but it offered the possibility of biological innovations that could benefit humanity even as they prepared for future conflicts. As the evening settled over Macragge and the alien stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the survivors of the First Tyrannic War would often gather in small groups to share quiet conversation about their experiences. These were not formal debriefings or tactical discussions, but simple human connections between people who had shared something profound and transformative. Brother Sergeant Ultracius would sometimes speak of his final moments with Captain Invictus in the reactor chamber, not dwelling on the tragedy of loss, but celebrating the nobility of sacrifice. Veterans of the Void battles would describe the strange beauty of bioships dying in the darkness of space, their bioluminescent patterns creating aurora-like displays as their life functions ceased. Civilian survivors would share memories of the evacuation camps, not focusing on the hardships they had endured, but on the small acts of kindness that had sustained them through their darkest hours. Children would listen to these stories with the rapt attention of young minds trying to understand how ordinary people had found extraordinary courage. We were afraid, the survivors would often admit to their young audiences. We were terrified, confused, and often despairing. But we continued to act with honor, because we understood that our individual fears were less important than our collective survival. That understanding transformed us from victims into victors. This was not simply restoration, but transformation. Humanity had learned not just how to survive the Tyranid threat, but how to grow stronger through the experience of facing extinction. The species that would meet the next Hive fleet invasion would be fundamentally different from the one that had barely survived the first. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the silent vigil maintained its watch over the darkness, and the memorial gardens released their subtle fragrances into the cool air, it was possible to feel a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of victory, for greater battles lay ahead, but the completion of understanding. Humanity had learned what it meant to face extinction and choose survival. They had discovered reservoirs of courage and determination that they had not known they possessed. Most importantly, they had proven to themselves and to the galaxy that even the most overwhelming enemy could be defeated by beings who refused to surrender what they held most sacred. The Great Devourer would return, bringing with it hunger and adaptation that had consumed entire galaxies. But it would find humanity ready, not with weapons alone, but with the deeper strength that comes from having been tested in the crucible of ultimate conflict and emerging with their humanity intact. The First Tyrannic War had ended, but its legacy would endure forever. In the rebuilt fortress monastery, in the memorial gardens, in the stories passed down through generations, and most importantly, in the quiet confidence of a species that had learned to face the darkness without despair. The Emperor protects those who protect themselves, and humanity had learned to be worthy of that protection. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was indeed only war, but there was also hope, courage, and the unshakable determination of those who had chosen to stand against the hungry void and declare with absolute conviction, "We will not go quietly into that dark night. We will endure. We will prevail. We will remember." And in that remembrance, in that determination, in that refusal to surrender to despair, lay the true victory over the Great Devourer. Not just the defeat of a single Hive fleet, but the preservation of everything that made existence meaningful in a universe that seemed bent on consuming all meaning. The stars continued to shine in the alien sky above Macragge, and beneath them, humanity rested, not in the sleep of the defeated, but in the peaceful vigilance of those who had earned their place among the survivors. The story continued, as all good stories must, in the dreams and determination of those who carried it forward into whatever darkness might come. 25 years had passed since the last Tyranid organism was purged from the Macragge system, and the fortress monastery had settled into rhythms that would have been unrecognizable to the Space Marines who had first built it. The ancient stones now carried within their structure bioreactive elements that could detect Tyranid spores at the molecular level, while the corridors hummed with the subtle harmonics of early warning systems that monitored the void beyond the galaxy's edge. Brother Captain Titus, who had been a mere initiate during the siege, now commanded the 4th Company with the wisdom of one who had learned warfare against the most challenging enemy humanity had ever faced. His morning inspection tours through the fortress revealed the profound changes that had transformed not just the physical structure, but the very culture of the chapter. New recruits no longer trained solely against human or orc combat scenarios. Their education included months of preparation for fighting biological enemies, whose capabilities exceeded anything in conventional Imperial doctrine. Mock battles were conducted in environments designed to simulate the inside of bioships, while psychological conditioning prepared young Space Marines for the unique horror of facing enemies that viewed them as nothing more than organic resources. The chapter's librarium had been transformed into something resembling a combination of military archive and biological research facility. Ancient texts on warfare sat alongside detailed studies of Tyranid biology, while tactical manuals shared shelf space with philosophical treatises on the nature of consciousness and evolution. The knowledge that had been gained through 25 years of peace was as valuable as any victory won through warfare. Epistolary Castor, who had been one of Chief Librarian Tigurius's most promising students, now served as the keeper of the memory vaults, crystalline storage devices that contained not just factual information about the invasion, but psychic impressions captured from the participants. Future generations of Space Marines could literally experience the memories of veterans who had fought against the Hive fleet, gaining understanding that no written account could provide. Memory is the foundation of wisdom. Coster would remind visitors to the vaults, but psychic memory is something deeper. It is the preservation of experience itself. When the next invasion comes, our battle brothers will not face the unknown. They will carry within their minds the accumulated experience of everyone who survived the First War. The technology that made such memory preservation possible had been developed through careful study of Tyranid neural networks. Imperial scientists had learned to replicate certain aspects of the hive mind's information-sharing capabilities, creating human networks that could distribute tactical knowledge instantaneously across entire military formations. This innovation had required extensive cooperation with the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose initial skepticism about biological technology had gradually given way to grudging acceptance of its strategic value. Tech priests working on Macragge had developed new theological frameworks that incorporated biological adaptation as an expression of the Omnissiah's will, allowing them to work with technologies that would have been considered heretical in previous centuries. Master of the Forge Hadron, who had succeeded Gaiax following his elevation to the rank of Iron Father, supervised workshops where the boundaries between mechanical and biological engineering were constantly being redefined. Weapons were grown as much as they were manufactured, their living components carefully integrated with traditional Imperial technology to create hybrid systems of unprecedented effectiveness. We have learned that the machine spirit is not limited to purely mechanical forms. Hadron explained to a delegation of visiting tech priests, life itself is a form of technology, perhaps the most sophisticated technology in the universe. By understanding this principle, we can create tools that combine the reliability of Imperial engineering with the adaptability of biological systems. The Fortress Monastery's armory now contained weapons that could modify their function in response to the type of enemy they encountered. These innovations had been shared throughout the Imperium, but Macragge remained the center of anti-Tyranid research and development. The chapter's experiences during the siege had provided insights that could not be replicated through theoretical study, and their continuing vigilance had revealed patterns in the approaching Hive fleets that other observers had missed. The civilian population of the Ultramar sector had developed into something unique within the Imperium, a society that lived with the constant awareness of cosmic threat while maintaining the cultural richness that made life worth preserving. Children grew up learning both advanced mathematics and wilderness survival skills, while artists created works that celebrated human achievement while acknowledging the fragility of existence. The University of Macragge had become one of the most prestigious institutions of learning in the galaxy, its curriculum combining traditional subjects with specialized courses in xenobiology, long-term strategic planning, and what scholars called extinction studies, the examination of how civilizations respond to existential threats. Professor Helena Vex, formerly Captain Voss of the Imperial Navy, taught courses on adaptive warfare that drew students from across the galaxy. Her classroom discussions combined rigorous tactical analysis with philosophical examination of what it meant to fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Strategy is not just about winning battles. Professor Vex would tell her students during lectures that had become legendary throughout the academic community. It is about preserving the capacity to continue fighting indefinitely if necessary. The enemy we face operates on timescales that dwarf human comprehension. Our response must be equally enduring. These changes had not reduced the sector's prosperity, but rather had created new forms of wealth based on knowledge, adaptability, and resilience. The weapons manufactured in Ultramar's forges were sought after throughout the galaxy, not just for their effectiveness, but for their ability to function reliably under the most extreme conditions. We have learned to think like hunters rather than soldiers, Admiral Severus explained during a presentation to the Imperial Naval Academy. Our enemies are not machines to be disabled, but organisms to be killed. This requires fundamentally different approaches to weapons design, tactical doctrine, and crew training. The fleet's most innovative vessels were the living ships, hybrid constructs that incorporated carefully controlled biological components within traditional Imperial hull designs. These vessels could repair damage autonomously, adapt their configuration for different mission requirements, and even reproduce certain components if properly supplied with raw materials. Such technology remained controversial within certain factions of the Imperium, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Living ships had proven capable of operating independently for years at a time, making them ideal for long-range reconnaissance missions into the void beyond the galaxy's edge. Scout Sergeant Ventress, one of Teleon's most accomplished students, commanded a squadron of these advanced reconnaissance vessels that maintained constant surveillance of the approaching Hive fleets. His reports provided detailed intelligence about alien capabilities that no conventional ship could have gathered. "They are changing as they approach," Ventress reported during one of his regular briefings. "Each fleet shows adaptations that appear to be responses to intelligence about our previous victory. They are learning from Behemoth's defeat and preparing countermeasures for the tactics that proved effective against them." This intelligence had led to the development of deception strategies, designed to mislead the approaching Hive fleets about Imperial capabilities. False tactical information was deliberately allowed to be captured by Tyranid scout organisms, while genuine innovations were carefully concealed until they could be deployed with maximum effect. The psychological preparation for the next invasion had become as important as the military preparation. Civilian populations throughout the sector participated in regular drills that practiced rapid evacuation procedures, while mental health specialists worked to ensure that the constant awareness of threat did not paralyze society with fear. Children who had grown up with this preparation showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. They understood that their world might be consumed tomorrow, but they also understood that such consumption was not inevitable. It was simply another challenge that human ingenuity and determination could overcome. The memorial services that marked the anniversary of the siege had evolved into celebrations of human endurance that drew visitors from across the galaxy. Brother Dreadnought Invictus, now venerated throughout the chapter as a living saint, would address these gatherings with words that had been carefully preserved and transmitted throughout the Imperium. His mechanical form had become a symbol of the principle that death itself could not defeat those who served a cause greater than themselves. "We are the Eternal Watch," Invictus would intone, his voice carrying across assemblies that numbered in the millions. "We stand guard not just against the enemies that approach from outside our galaxy, but against the despair and hopelessness that would destroy us from within. Every day we maintain our vigilance as a victory against the forces that would reduce us to mere biological material." Chief Librarian Tigurius, now ancient even by Space Marine standards, had achieved a level of psychic mastery that allowed him to perceive patterns across decades of observation. His consciousness could stretch across the galaxy, touching the minds of other psychers who maintained watch against the approaching threat. This intelligence had profound implications for Imperial defensive strategy. The approaching invasion would not be a series of separate attacks that could be defeated individually, but rather a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm humanity's ability to respond effectively. New levels of cooperation between different factions of the Imperium would be required to meet such a challenge. The High Lords of Terra had authorized the creation of new military formations specifically designed for galaxy-wide coordination against the Tyranid threat. These forces drew personnel from across the Imperium, their training conducted on worlds that had been transformed into massive military academies. Macragge had become the primary training facility for these new forces, its experience during the First Tyrannic War providing the foundation for doctrines that would guide humanity's response to future invasions. Veterans of the siege served as instructors, sharing their knowledge with warriors who came from distant star systems. "Every lesson we learned was purchased with blood," Captain Titus would remind the trainees who studied under his guidance. "Every tactic we developed was tested against enemies who sought our complete extinction. What we teach you is not theory. It is knowledge that has been proven in the crucible of absolute warfare." The fortress monastery's chapel had been rebuilt as a shrine to human endurance, its walls bearing the names not just of those who had died during the siege, but of everyone who had contributed to humanity's survival. Scientists who had developed new weapons, civilians who had maintained supply lines, children who had carried messages through battle zones. All were honored equally as heroes of the species. Chaplain Matthias, who had served as Cassius's successor, conducted services that combined traditional imperial faith with new theological insights that had emerged from humanity's encounter with cosmic predators. His sermons addressed questions that previous generations of imperial citizens had never needed to consider: what it meant to be human in a universe that seemed designed to consume humanity. "Faith is not the absence of fear," Chaplain Matthias would tell his congregations. "Faith is the decision to act with honor despite fear, to preserve what is sacred despite the knowledge that everything we cherish is fragile. We worship the Emperor not because he protects us from all harm, but because he shows us how to remain human even when facing the inhuman. The approaching Hive fleets remained years away from reaching Imperial space, but their influence was already being felt throughout human civilization. Workers in distant Forge worlds labored to produce weapons that would be needed for battles they would never see. Scholars on civilized worlds developed strategies that would be implemented by generals not yet born. Children throughout the galaxy learned skills that would help them survive encounters with enemies that defied imagination. The Eternal Watch continued, as it had for 25 years, and as it would for centuries to come. In the Fortress Monastery, in the orbital defense platforms, in the minds of every citizen who understood what was at stake, vigilance was maintained against the hungry darkness that approached from beyond the stars. The Great Devourer would return, bringing with it hunger and adaptation that had consumed entire galaxies. But it would find humanity ready, not just with weapons and fortifications, but with the deeper strength that came from understanding what they were fighting for and why their struggle mattered. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the memorial gardens released their fragrances into the cool air and the eternal flames burned steadily in their shrines, the watch continued. It would continue until the stars burned out, maintained by those who had chosen to stand guard against the darkness, and who understood that some things were worth preserving even at the cost of everything else. The story was not over. It would never be over, as long as there were those willing to carry it forward into whatever trials lay ahead. In the deepest hours of the night, when even the Fortress Monastery of the Ultramarines had settled into its most profound quiet, there existed a peace that transcended the constant vigilance of the Eternal Watch. It was not the peace of the unaware, nor the false calm of the defeated, but the deep tranquility that comes to those who have faced the ultimate test and discovered within themselves reservoirs of strength they had never known they possessed. Brother Sergeant Ultracius, now ancient by the standards of even Space Marines, would often spend these quiet hours in the memorial gardens where the consumed city of Hera had once stood. The bioreactive flowers that grew there had adapted to the subtle traces of alien influence that would forever mark Macragge's soil, their blooms displaying colors that had never been seen in nature before the invasion. Life finds its own way. Ultracius would sometimes murmur to himself as he walked among the memorial paths. His words echoed those that Chapter Master Calgar had spoken decades before, but they carried within them the accumulated wisdom of someone who had witnessed humanity's capacity for renewal firsthand. The Fortress Monastery itself had become a place of pilgrimage not just for warriors, but for philosophers, artists, and ordinary citizens seeking to understand what it meant to be human in a universe that contained forces capable of consuming entire civilizations. The chapter's archives were consulted by scholars who were developing new frameworks for understanding humanity's place in cosmic history. They didn't survive because they were fearless, Dr. Chen observed during one of her presentations. They survived because they learned to function effectively while afraid. Fear became a tool rather than a paralysis, a source of information about danger that could be processed and responded to without being overwhelmed by it. This research had contributed to new approaches to psychological preparation throughout the Imperium. Rather than trying to eliminate fear of the Tyranid threat, educators worked to help citizens understand fear as a natural and useful response that could be channeled into productive action. The children who had grown up during the Reconstruction showed remarkable emotional stability despite their early exposure to accounts of cosmic horror. They displayed what psychologists called earned optimism, hope that was based not on ignorance of danger, but on evidence that challenges could be overcome through collective effort and individual courage. The Tyranids taught us that nothing is permanent. Marcus would explain to visitors who questioned how young people could maintain hope while living under constant threat. But they also taught us that nothing is inevitable. Destruction is possible, but so is survival. Consumption is possible, but so is resistance. We choose which possibility to work toward. This philosophical maturity was reflected in the art and literature that had emerged from the post-siege period. Creative works that dealt with the invasion tended to focus not on the horror of the events, but on the human responses that had made survival possible. Epic poems celebrated the courage of individuals while acknowledging their vulnerability. Paintings depicted the siege's battles as struggles between different approaches to existence, rather than simple conflicts between good and evil. The cultural archive of Macragge had become one of the galaxy's most important repositories of what scholars called existential art, creative works that explored questions of meaning and purpose in the face of cosmic indifference. These works were studied throughout the Imperium as examples of how conscious beings could create beauty and significance even while acknowledging the fundamental fragility of their existence. Composer Elena Vasquez had created symphonic works that incorporated the actual sound patterns of bioship communications, transforming alien signals into musical forms that human consciousness could appreciate and understand. Her compositions were performed throughout the galaxy, helping audiences process their emotional responses to the Tyranid threat through aesthetic experience. Music allows us to find beauty in what terrifies us, Vasquez explained during interviews about her work. By transforming the sounds of our enemies into art, we demonstrate that human consciousness can incorporate anything, even the most alien experiences, into meaningful patterns. The religious implications of humanity's encounter with the Great Devourer had been explored by theological scholars who were developing new interpretations of imperial faith. The traditional focus on the emperor's protector had been supplemented by emphasis on his role as teacher, the being who had shown humanity how to remain human even under the most extreme circumstances. Cardinal Matthias Thorn, who had overseen the spiritual counseling of siege survivors, had written extensively about what he called apocalyptic faith belief systems that acknowledged the possibility of extinction while maintaining commitment to values that transcended individual survival. The Emperor's greatest gift to humanity was not the promise of safety. Cardinal Thorn argued in his theological treatises. It was the example of how to act with honor even when facing ultimate defeat. Faith means choosing to serve something greater than ourselves even when, especially when, that service might cost us everything. This theological framework had provided comfort to millions of imperial citizens who struggled with the psychological burden of living under constant existential threat. Rather than promising that faith would protect them from harm, it taught that faith could preserve their essential humanity, even if their physical forms were destroyed. The military preparations for the approaching Hive fleets continued with methodical precision, but they were now integrated into a broader cultural project of species preservation. Training facilities served not just to prepare warriors, but to maintain and transmit the knowledge and values that made human civilization worth defending. The Schola Progenium had developed curricula that combined military training with education in art, philosophy, and cultural history. Future commissars and officers learned not just how to fight effectively, but why their fight mattered and what they were trying to preserve through their sacrifice. Brother Captain Titus, who now served as one of the chapter's senior instructors, had developed training programs that emphasized the psychological as well as tactical challenges of fighting biological enemies. The Fortress Monastery's youngest Space Marines often spent their free time in the memorial gardens, not in somber contemplation, but in quiet appreciation of the beauty that had emerged from devastation. They would study the bioreactive flowers, observe the patterns of light that played across the memorial walls, and listen to the subtle harmonics of the early warning systems that hummed throughout the complex. These young warriors understood that they were part of a story that stretched back to the earliest days of human civilization and forward to possibilities that could not yet be imagined. They were not simply soldiers preparing for battle, but guardians of something precious that had been tested in the crucible of cosmic conflict and had emerged with its essential nature intact. Brother Initiate Marcus, recently elevated from the scout companies, often served as a guide for civilian visitors to the memorial gardens. His explanations of the siege's events were detailed and accurate, but they were delivered with a calm acceptance that helped his audiences process the magnitude of what they were learning. People sometimes ask if we're afraid of the next invasion. Marcus would tell groups of visitors. The answer is yes. We understand the danger, and we respond to it appropriately. But fear doesn't rule our lives. We've learned that consciousness itself is an act of defiance against a universe that seems designed to eliminate consciousness. Simply by continuing to think, to create, to love, we defeat our enemies in the most fundamental way possible. Chief Librarian Tigurius, now so ancient that his enhanced physiology was the only thing keeping him functional, had achieved a form of psychic awareness that transcended normal human limitations. His consciousness could perceive patterns across decades of observation, sensing connections and developments that other minds could not grasp. In his final years, Tiberius had begun to understand the approaching Hive fleets not just as military threats, but as part of a cosmic evolutionary process that operated on scales beyond normal comprehension. We represent something unique in the universe. And Tiberius would tell the select few who were permitted to consult with him during his final years. Consciousness that creates meaning rather than simply consuming resources. The Tyranids are perfect biological machines, but they cannot appreciate beauty, cannot create art, cannot love. In preserving these capacities, we preserve something that has value beyond mere survival. The approaching Hive fleets remained a constant presence in strategic planning, but their threat had been integrated into a broader understanding of humanity's cosmic role. Rather than viewing the invasion as an interruption of normal existence, Imperial citizens had learned to see it as part of an ongoing process of species development that would continue indefinitely. Preparation for the next war had become a way of life rather than a desperate emergency measure. Training, research, cultural preservation, and philosophical development were all understood as aspects of a single project, the maintenance of human consciousness in a universe that seemed indifferent to its existence. The silent vigil continued each night, but it had evolved into something more than a memorial observance. The citizens who gathered in darkness to remember the fallen were also celebrating the living, acknowledging their own participation in a story that had meaning beyond individual survival. In the memorial gardens where bioreactive flowers bloomed in impossible colors and the names of heroes were inscribed in stone that would endure for millennia, the watch continued. Children who had never known a world without the threat of cosmic predators played games that incorporated lessons about adaptation and survival. Artists created works that transformed accounts of horror into expressions of hope. Scholars developed theories that placed human experience within frameworks vast enough to encompass the approach of galaxy-consuming entities. The Great Devourer would return, bringing with it hunger and adaptation that had consumed civilizations beyond counting. But it would find humanity ready, not just with weapons and fortifications, but with the deeper strength that came from understanding what consciousness meant and why its preservation mattered. The story that had begun with the first spore falling on Tyran would continue as long as there were conscious beings willing to carry it forward. It was a story about fear overcome through courage, about meaning created through choice, about the decision to remain human even when facing forces that denied the value of humanity. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the memorial gardens released their subtle fragrances, and the eternal flames burned steadily in their shrines, peace settled over Macragge like a benediction. It was not the peace of the unaware, but the deep tranquility of those who had faced the darkness and discovered within themselves light enough to kindle hope for generations yet to come. The watch would continue, the preparation would continue, the story would continue, carried forward by those who understood that consciousness itself was both fragile and eternal, fragile in its individual manifestations, eternal in its capacity to create meaning from chaos and hope from despair. The peaceful darkness embraced them all. Heroes and survivors, the living and the dead, the born and the yet to be born, in the eternal story of consciousness defending itself against the void. One choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one act of love at a time. The Emperor protects, but only those who choose to protect what makes protection meaningful. And in the memorial gardens of Macragge, where impossible flowers bloomed in tribute to impossible courage, that choice was made anew each day, as it would be made tomorrow, and all the tomorrows yet to come. Sleep well, guardians of memory. The watch continues, and the story endures.